Chapter 1. The Pulse of the City. The rain arrived like rumor before it became fact. First as a fine grain that sketched itself across windshields and eyelids, then as a steady weight that pressed the streets into a reflective version of themselves. The city's lights, pharmacy crosses, deli signs, the blue-white rectangles of apartment windows where insomniacs kept company with their screens, sank into the pavement and rippled as if a second city lay below the first, turned upside down and breathing with a slower, deeper lung. Tires hissed through zebra crossings. Buses sighed at the curb and shouldered back into traffic. The night air had that laundromat-clean smell of wet concrete that makes even sin feel new. Adrian moved at a human pace with human inconveniences. Shoulder nudges, umbrella ribs tapping his ear, a shoe that found a hidden pothole and drank cold water through the laces. He performed irritation, not immunity. He checked a watch that did not tick and pressed his mouth into the thin line of someone weighing whether to hail a cab or accept being wet. He had learned long ago that invisibility is an act of exquisite mimicry, never the dramatic flourish of a vanishing trick, but the practiced choreography of belonging to the background. Be the gentle draft when the door opens. Be the person who always seems to be just leaving. The music of the city, its true music, was not the horns or the shouts or the club spill thudding at the ends of alleys. It was the soft hydraulics inside bodies. When he allowed himself to hear it fully, the rest of the world fell a notch out of focus, and he could stand beneath an awning and listen to the living the way a stargazer listens to the sky. Across the street, a barback running a tray of clean glasses through a warm sink. Quick pulse, rough fingertips, coffee for dinner. At his back, a woman in a red coat waiting at the bus stop, one heel worrying a crack in the pavement. The rhythm of someone who has lived inside deadlines for years and now keeps them for sport. Around the corner, a teenager trying not to run, a scramble of heartbeats so fast they braided into one tremolo, the terror of being late confiscating logic. Above, 3 floors up, an old man coughing between sips of whiskey, while a TV filled his room with substitute voices. Tonight, the orchestra had a wrong note in it. He tasted it first at the base of his tongue, a metallic thread, a glistening wire drawn through the night's fabric. The city can smell like a lot of things in the rain. Hot rubber, fried food, the green syrup of broken pine boughs at a fruit stand. But nothing impersonates the particular brightness of blood made public. It is not simply iron. It is iron married to panic. It is warmth that dared the cold to notice it. This was recent, sloppy, and badly placed. Adrian exhaled through his nose, a patient sound, and let his feet choose the route that note suggested. He passed a glassed-in barber shop where a man with a towel around his neck watched himself in a wavering mirror while the barber drew a razor along the slope of his jaw. The image doubled, steadied, doubled again in the window as the wind played with the dangling string of a paper sign. He stepped around a pair of club kids performing ballet with a bodega umbrella that had inverted like a dead jellyfish in a gust. On a corner, the hot chest of a street vendor's cart steamed into the rain. Pretzels bronzing under a heat lamp, a lone sausage roped with mustard. The vendor, eyes half-lidded against water and fatigue, stood as if he had been poured there and set. The wrongness, when he faced it, did not announce itself with spectacle. It never does at first. What he came to was a service alley behind a neon-sick club where the music thumped more in the ribs than in the ear, and where the door, heavy, red, repainted a dozen times, opened and closed on intervals as steady as a metronome. The alley had the honest stink of refuse and beer and 1,000 crushed cigarettes that rain could not ransom. And there, between brick and dumpster, in the protected rectangle that wind rarely touched, an oblong smear, dark within dark, with corners blurred by water but not yet erased. He crouched. He put the first 2 knuckles of his right hand to the wall and balanced as he leaned, letting the rain thread his hair against his temple. 2 fingers touched the smear, and the city's incidental noises stepped away from him in a respectful arc cold slick, still tacky where the trickle had thickened. He lifted his hand, brought his fingers to his mouth, and let the smallest part of the story onto his tongue. Copper, but bright. Stress hormones still singing their ending. Young. He could smell perfume over the iron, could hear, if he stood in it, the sequence. Surprise, breath caught, the squall of adrenaline, the misstep, the hand on brick, the drop. It was not the first of the night. It would not be the last. Whoever had done this fed like a man filling both hands from a fruit stand and walking away with a grin, skins and pulp trailing the sidewalk. It was not hunger that angered Adrian. Hunger is a math problem. Inputs, outputs, survival. It was the disregard. He wiped his fingers on the brick, an old habit that felt ceremonial, and rose. The bouncer at the door gave him a look that asked nothing and offered less. They had an understanding without a language for it. Men who work doors know the taxonomy of trouble by smell. Adrian tilted his chin the faintest fraction toward the smear so the bouncer would mark it and own it. And then he moved on, letting the red door close and the night sweat hush retake the mouth of the alley. Every city tolerates gods until those gods demand a pageant. He had seen the pageants. He had felt the heat of 30 torches moving like a beast too large to curve through narrow streets without scraping the houses, and he had stood on bridges and watched the brown-yellow light settle on water in quilts. The thing that kills you is not the flame. It is the song people sing while carrying it. It has an innocence. He had learned, long ago, but not long enough for the lesson to loosen in him, never to be the excuse for that kind of singing again. He walked to cool himself. That was one of his small disciplines. When anger came, put it into motion without destination. The city obliged by providing a circuit of distractions that did not quite earn the name beauty, but could pass for it at that hour. A laundromat where the lone attendant sat in a plastic chair with a paperback bent in one hand while the machines thudded their wet clothes around like distracted giants. A florist stripping thorns from roses under a fluorescent hum and arranging what would look like spontaneity in the morning. A cat with the broken dignity of a monarch in exile, sitting in the center of the threshold to a pawn shop, watching rain as if it were a performance piece that needed editing. There is a particular way a camera's presence changes the air, even when you cannot see it. Humans feel it as self-consciousness or irritation, like the itch where a healing cut is knitting. Adrian felt it as a slight standing of hairs along the forearm, as a coolness on the back of the neck. Somewhere upper left, the rain was hitting metal in a pattern that did not belong to a rooftop drain or a fire escape. He looked without looking, 2 roofs over, on a parapet crusted with pigeon leavings and the grit that never leaves a city. A lens blinked open, then half shut against a drop, then open again. Not police. The police looked down with the hungry disinterest of institutions. This was focused, patient, a person's project. He stepped under the fluorescent awning of a bodega, more for the shadow line than the dryness, and watched an entire mid-block life pass him in 3 minutes, as if the street were a conveyor belt. A trio of teenagers in translucent rain ponchos rehearsed a dance step silently, counting under their breath, laughter puncturing the discipline. A woman in scrubs with a lunch pail touched her phone and smiled at a message, and then shook her head at her own smile. A cabbie slapped his steering wheel in time to a song from 15 years ago. A man in a suit too thin for the weather carried a box of donuts, like a sacrament. These were the living, not in the way poets mean it when they get fancy, but in the way the cash register means it when it rings. Small economics of survival. His chest ached with a familiar, unnameable tenderness he sometimes felt for the ordinary. It was not love, and not pity, and not envy. It was kinship of a sort, with all creatures building routines to keep terror at the edge of vision. He had never believed in leaving no trace. He believed in leaving the right traces, and leaving them in the correct hands. The city's immune system, underfunded, haphazard, part-time, and glory-hungry and weary, still deserved respect. He crossed to the curb, bent as if to retie a shoelace, and with that small theater quietly placed a phone photo into the pocket of the nearest door worker who would notice it and call. The photo was not of anyone's face. It was of a smear, the way water ran around it, the handprint sunk inside it. A description in the caption that would be bureaucratically irresistible. He did not choose heroes. He chose procedures. The metallic note had not faded. It braided through the smell of rain and cheap gin, through the exhaust sourness, through the bakery sweetness of a night shift at the corner. It pointed south. Adrian followed, not so linear as to seem intent, not so meandering as to lose it. He cut across a park where the trees looked like saints with their robes dragged by the weight of wet leaves. The lamps haloed droplets, and a jogger went by like a confident ghost. He descended a flight of stairs that dropped him into a block built before sidewalks learned to be wide. There the storefronts tucked into themselves, their awnings frilled with gutters, their glass fronts misted opaque. The sound of the city grew cavernous in that narrowness, like listening to an ocean from the wrong end of a shell. He passed a doorway without stepping into it. That is a sentence simple to read and difficult to do. Every instinct said, shelter. Every discipline said, no. The doorway belonged to a derelict electronic shop where pale televisions held an eternal loop of snow. Behind the counter, invisible, was a man who came at unpredictable hours because the rent was cheap and because he believed in one good day arriving. Adrian had an inventory of such places, their hours, their entrances, their sightlines. He moved on because safety is often the ugliest trap. When the smell sharpened, he knew he was near the original carelessness, not merely its echoes. He slowed because he could afford to. A flock of taxis pumped an argument into being and dispersed it. The rain thinned to something like confetti. The wrongness amplified. He saw the shape at the alley mouth and knew it for what it was and for what it wanted to be. Youth has its own light, newly dead. It throws that light like jewelry. The figure leaned with good posture, the kind of performative looseness that says I am relaxed. The rain collected on his leather like varnish. Handsome. This is a banal observation, but accuracy sometimes is. The grin on his mouth was not cruelty. It was enjoyment of the silhouette he made in a stranger's reflection. The group of girls coming out of the club promised chaos and delight. He looked at them the way a child looks at a cake, at once hungry and artistically curious about where to cut. Adrian did not say the boy's name. He did not yet know it. He did not call out or speed up or adopt any other dramatic posture. He merely set his angle to intersect the other's angle at a point that in geometry produces a simple X and in streets produces conversation or collision. The red door behind the girls opened and closed and opened. The music rifled the alley. The bouncer stamped a hand. A camera glanced from the roof like a reptile eye. As he approached, a thought cooled and took its correct shape in him, the way molten metal becomes itself when it meets air. This city will endure us if we are humble. It will kill us if we insist on being interesting. He stepped into the angle at which two weather systems meet and make their own lightning. The grin on the young man's face widened as if he had expected this interception without having planned for it. When he spoke, his voice had the brittle chime of someone who knew words could be used to steer attention. But that conversation and its consequences belonged to the next hour, a different chapter of night. For now, Adrian marked the net that had been hung across this block, the lens, the bouncer, the alley's dimensions, the slick that flowed toward the sewer grate and then detoured around gum pressed into the groove. And he marked, too, the particular tenor of the rain. That softening at the edges of drops that means the sky is about to ease, that the city is about to look like it forgot what it just did. He thought, not yet. He thought, I will not allow you to tidy this away before it becomes a rule in you. He drew a slow breath, because in the presence of hunger you must never breathe fast, and let the wet night settle into his lungs. He recalled the face of the baker's boy, the rope of kindling on the shoulder, the whistled tune he has refused for centuries to hum. It steadied him. It sharpened the small mercy he vowed to spend on this city like loose change, unnoticed, cumulative, the only kind that ever buys anything. Adrian adjusted the fall of his coat and stood, At last, fully inside the moment that would carry the night forward. The city's pulse rolled under his feet. A bus exhaled. Rain stitched light to pavement one more time and then began, with ceremony, to slacken. He lifted his eyes to the young man's and in them saw the exact proportions of ignorance and appetite that make trouble wear a handsome face. He did not decide to save or to damn him. He decided to be the seam that keeps the fabric from tearing when fools pull it taut. The chapter of the city's heartbeat turned the page. Chapter 2, the alleyway. The alley was a throat, and the night slid down it. The club's red door swung on a hinge that had learned the weight of every kind of exit. Lovers giggling, brawlers bleeding, bartenders seeking 3 minutes of air. It exhaled heat and bass and human sugar into the rain, then shut, then exhaled again. Cigarette tips budded and died, tiny red planets blooming on and off as fingers cupped flames against the weather. The bouncer leaned beneath his plastic poncho with a stance as wide and patient as a loading dock. He did not look at Adrian. He did not look at Victor. Men who keep doors alive know when to let the night debate itself. Victor's grin had edges. The rain slicked his hair to those high, careless cheekbones and haunted the leather of his jacket like varnish. He could have passed for any handsome boy in the city who had not yet been disabused of the belief that momentum equals destiny. But his eyes gave him away, and not only to Adrian. His pupils had the wrong hunger, too steady, like a man studying an architectural drawing instead of a person. He didn't leer at the girl's legs. He calculated trajectories. They came out of the door in a bouquet of perfume and wet glitter, laughing the way people laugh when the room they've just left has rewritten them as better versions of themselves. One peeled away to text in the alley shelter. One checked her lipstick by the unreliable mirror of a phone screen. One said, "No, seriously, tell me," to someone who'd stopped listening 2 drinks ago. All of them were alive in the way that makes the air warmer, simply by their being there. The rain purled on their eyelashes. Victor lifted his chin toward them as a man might toward a plate that is rightfully his. Adrian stepped into the angle that carried him between intention and object, not blocking, not challenging, simply existing at the precise point where the line through the night must bend around him. "Evening," Victor said with a drawl that put the word on its side, an affectation of ease. The drawl was new. He'd built it in the last week or 2 because he liked the way it looked on him. "Pick another street." "Someone is leaving trash," Adrian said, as if speaking to the alley rather than the boy. He kept his voice at that intimate volume the rain loves, letting it soak rather than bounce. "The city notices trash. It sends trucks." Victor's teeth flashed. "The city's mine," he said. "I like it messy. Mess is honest. Mess is loud," Adrian said. "Loud brings hunters." Something inside Victor's gaze flared and then cooled, annoyance tempered by curiosity. "Hunters," he repeated, tasting the S, making it plural enough to be a challenge. "You say that like you've met them." "I've met the songs they sing," Adrian said. A drunk flopped out of the door on a tide of bass and squealed at the rain like it had snuck up on him. He looked at Adrian and Victor without seeing either, then whirlpooled back indoors. The bouncer's eyes slid that way and returned. Victor shifted his weight. The movement was beautiful. Youth has a way of making even impatience look choreographed. He did not ask who Adrian was. He did not ask why. He asked the question that matters to boys who want to be legends. "How old are you?" he said, with a smile that promised to be impressed with the right answer. "Old enough to have names for mistakes you haven't made yet," Adrian said gently. "And to know which ones you survive only once." A tiny frown dented Victor's pretty certainty. He pushed off the brick and came closer, as if closer were a language he was fluent in. Raindrops collected in the tender hollow at the base of his throat. He smelled of good soap and impatience. "You sound like a priest," he said. "What are you, etiquette for ghosts?" "I'm a man who prefers not to see cities burn," Adrian said. "And who knows the precise sound a crowd makes when it's one story away from picking up torches?" Victor's mouth twitched, amused despite himself. You're very municipal." He made municipal into a sin. "I didn't crawl out to say sorry." "You crawled out to endure," Adrian said. "Existing is cheap. Endurance is expensive." The girl with the phone hook-stepped closer to them, scrolling, her thumbs a private metronome. Victor's focus slid toward her, without moving his gaze. It was an old trick, letting the head stay put while the eyes measure distance. And it transformed the wet air between them into something delicate and dangerous. Adrian took one half-step left, enough to send the girl a signal she did not consciously read. "This is a hallway, not a room." "Careful," he said, and did not specify which of them he addressed. Victor huffed a laugh up the bridge of his nose. "I can be careful," he said, and made can sound like a weapon. "No signatures," Adrian said. "No patterns. No flourish you'd want to be known by." "Known by whom?" Victor asked, genuinely puzzled. He had not yet learned that attention is a trap set by both admirers and enemies. "By the ones with maps," Adrian said, and put his face at the angle that let the rooftop lens catch only the curve of his cheek and the line of his jaw, not the truth inside. "They are already watching." Victor tipped his head, followed the almost nothing of that glance, and saw the camera sheltering under a parapet, glinting like a reptile's patient blink. He didn't flinch. He flicked 2 fingers at it, a gesture that could read as hello or fuck you, or both. The impulse was boyish. The steadiness under it wasn't. He liked being watched. Hunger wears many outfits. "Fine," he said. "Teach me you're boring if it comes with a trick." "It does," Adrian said. "It's called leaving." Victor's smile went wolfish. "Predictable," he said, but he swung away from the girls and let them drift back to their laughter as if he'd never been there. The bouncer's shoulders loosened by a degree. They walked without agreeing to, parallel down the alley and into the open street where the rain had eased to a sheen. The city's nocturnal shift was cycling. Cooks hosing down sidewalks, barbacks taking out clattering bags, cabs sleeking past like big cats who know the routes by scent. Neon smeared the puddles into electric roofs. Somewhere, a fire truck idled, a red reflection pulsing on the glass of a storefront as steady as a heart. Victor stuck his hands into his jacket pockets the way boys do when they're deciding whether to fight or to flirt. "If you are not going to feed," he said. "What are you doing out here?" "Collecting citations." "I hear when the city coughs," Adrian said. "I check the lungs." A trash truck shouldered into the mouth of the street, its amber light revolving, wet metal groaning as it swallowed bags into its maw. 2 rats performed a little arithmetic with the timing of the truck's movements and escaped along the gutter with their dignity intact. Victor watched them with the casual interest of a man who likes to see the world's survival strategies. He seemed less eager to peel someone away from a group now and more inclined to try on this other appetite. Curiosity. "Where were you made?" he asked suddenly. "Here," he said, "here like a dare." "Not in a language you speak," Adrian said, and the kindness in it kept it from being a door slammed. Victor pretended not to mind. "I was made in a basement," he said. "Not even a sexy one. Laundry machines, bad light, the kind of mold that looks like a map of a country nobody visits." "Who did it?" Adrian asked. "A friend," Victor said, and made friend where a little gold for the first syllable and a little ash for the second. "He said I didn't have to be small anymore." "Ah," Adrian said. He remembered that sales pitch. It always comes at the exact hour a person is most exhausted with themselves. "I told him I wasn't small," Victor said, defensive. "And then you woke up hungry," Adrian said, not unkind, "and learned the difference between how you feel and how the world treats you." Victor's jaw angled. His arrogance reasserted itself, not as volume, but as poise. "I'm not apologizing for wanting to be seen." "I'm not asking you to apologize," Adrian said. "I'm asking you to consider whether being seen by strangers who hope you're interesting is a safe hobby." They passed the mouth of another alley where a kitchen crew smoked in a congregation of white jackets, each man in his own column of steam. One of them met Victor's eye, and looked away without knowing why his neck had cooled. A couple quarreled under a broken awning with the hissed intensity of people who will reconcile in under an hour and then pretend they never went this far. A man pushing a hand truck stacked higher than his head navigated an obstacle course of cratered asphalt and memory. Victor's head kept turning, not in the twitchy way of prey or the mechanical way of predator, but like a tourist in a city his body recognized before his mind did. The night made him aware of himself in a way that daylight never could. He radiated the desire to be named. "You want rules?" Adrian said.
"Fine.
"I will give you rules." "Now we're a church," Victor said and smiled. "Rule 1, Adrian said. The news must yawn. If a thing can be filmed, you are already doing it wrong. No theatrics, no alleyways with murals, no rooftops with cityscape views. Give that kind of night to music videos." Victor's smile stayed. "I'm very good on rooftops," he said. "Exactly," Adrian said. "So you don't go there." Victor's sigh came from somewhere he hadn't used for sighs before. "Rule 2, he asked, playing along. "Never sit in the chair that will be missed," Adrian said. "There is always a chair in every room that no one looks at twice, a corner stool, a back booth, the space near the ice machine. Sit there. It's terrible on the ego and very good for not making laws." Victor nodded. "This is the boring I was promised." "Rule 3, Adrian said. No signatures. You do not have a favorite. Not a favorite street. Not a favorite type. Not a favorite trick. I know you're composing one in your head right now, some elegant little ritual that will make you feel like a painter. Burn it. You want to practice an art? Learn how to leave nothing to notice." Victor's grin wasn't gone, but it was subdued into something sharper. "No flourishes," he said, practicing the sentence. "No signature. No fun. Fun is a luxury you can't afford until you're very old," Adrian said. "And even then the bill comes due." They crossed into a block where the lights thinned and the rain took on that shy, hesitant quality it has just before it stops. Fewer drops, fatter, falling with decisions. A lone courier pedaled past, hunched against the air, a big insulated box strapped to his back with a brand name that was trying too hard. Victor watched him, and, for an instant, something like wonder crossed his face. "What's in there?" he asked, a child's question that came out as a thief's. "French fries," Adrian said, "and secrets." "Secrets." Victor laughed. "Everything that keeps people alive," Adrian said. "Cash. Prescriptions. The heat of someone who loves you enough to order a burger at 2 a.m. and fall asleep before it arrives. The address they forgot to change after they moved in with the person they swore they wouldn't." Victor turned his head slowly, tracking the courier's red blinker until it merged with other small red hearts along the avenue. It felt, to Adrian, like showing a child the gears inside a clock and seeing him understand that time is a machine. They paused in the shallow lobby of a hardware store with a steel gate rolled down. Adrian did not step farther in. He leaned an elbow against the jamb, making of his whole posture a quiet refusal. Victor, who was built to read the stage directions of a room, noticed. He looked at the darkness past the counter, at the aisles that would be beautiful to vanish into, and then he looked at the line on the wet tile where clean met dirty. He stayed in the light. It was a small victory, but the city is built of nothing else. Someone shouted 2 blocks over, a sharp, bird-like sound that comes when a human body registers a threat. Victor lifted his face, nostrils flaring, the animal under the skin lending him a grace that felt inevitable. Adrian laid 2 fingertips on his sleeve and grounded him the way a man grounds a piece of machinery. Lightly, as if a static charge could leave a burn. "Count," Adrian said. Victor stilled because the word had a note inside it that made muscles obey. He looked without seeing the way the living see. He saw the restroom sign of a closed bar. He saw the way a puddle vibrated as a bus passed. He saw the reflection of a doorway and a car window and understood, dimly, why it mattered. He counted witnesses. He counted cameras. He counted lights. He counted bad angles and better ones and realized that the corridor he wanted to charge down ended in a wall and a lens. He took a breath, held it, breathed out through his nose the way you do when you're deciding not to throw a punch. "Good," Adrian said. "You can have that later when the weather is different." Victor offered up a sulky smile. "You make survival sound like meteorology." "It is," Adrian said. "Fronts, pressure systems, the chance of precipitation." He gestured with 2 fingers toward the sky. "And tonight's forecast is watched." They walked again, not away from the cry so much as around it. A cab took the corner too fast and sloshed a tide over the curb. A bicyclist swore like a poet. The bouncer from the alley stepped out to smoke and blew his first exhale up into the rain so that it came back down as a white veil. In a 3rd-floor window, a woman in a robe stood at a sink and washed grapes one by one, filling a bowl with future sweetness. The smallness of it steadied Adrian more than any rule he could articulate. "Tell me your name," Victor said abruptly, not as a demand, more as a confession that he wanted the word to put on the shape that had begun to occupy his night. "Adrian," he said, because sometimes a name is a tool that keeps both people honest. "Victor," the boy said with a theatrical little half-bow, as if presenting a business card. Adrian inclined his head, acknowledgement without ceremony. They came to the mouth of a stairwell that dropped into the city's subdermal layer. A steel door that looked locked and wasn't, the paint sullenly intact, the lintels filmed with the exact dust that gathers when a space is visited just enough to be suspicious and not enough to be loved. Every sense in Victor said, "Go." The night around the door carried a perfume of antiseptic and copper, faint even in the rain. His hand, without him deciding to move it, lifted 6 inches from his side. "No," Adrian said, and the single syllable didn't rise. It spread like warmth, like law. Victor half turned. "You think I'm some idiot child you can keep out of basements and liquor cabinets," he said, but the heat in it was theater. He wanted to be stopped as much as to go. "I think you will go wherever you like," Adrian said, "but not tonight. Tonight is for learning to look at a door and see the system around it." Victor's hand dropped. "What's behind it?" "A market," Adrian said. "They sell blood like you sell songs. Hyped, mislabeled, always worst when it's trending." Victor's eyes gleamed. "Underground economy," he said. He tasted the words like sugar. "You hate it." "I hate what it will make of you," Adrian said, loud, and then gone. The rain slackened to a ceremonial sprinkle, the sky staging its act of forgiveness. Victor looked at the door, and then away from it with the dignity of a boy deciding against stealing. He rocked once on his heels, checked his pockets like a self-search for contraband, and squared his shoulders into the new posture the night had trained into him. "Rule 4, he said, to show he was listening. "Look like accounting." Adrian almost smiled. "That was Rule 1, he said, "but I'll let you keep it as 4. You're more likely to remember the ones you name yourself." They turned their backs on the stairwell and the false promise of rooms where everything felt like being important. They turned toward the broader street, where the world continued its undramatic miracles. A woman picked a dime out of a puddle and laughed alone. A man in a delivery jacket paused in the middle of a crosswalk to wave at a child behind a rainy bus window. The neon script of a bakery flickered twice and steadied. A drone's faint insect threaded the air for a moment and then moved off toward richer rumor. The rooftop lens across the block had shifted to study a brighter scene, a happier fight. The city's attention is a tide. It cannot stay. It can only return. They walked under a bridge, where water dripped in a steady line like beads on a string. Victor stepped over the line. Adrian stepped through it. Both choices pleased the rain in different ways. They said nothing for a full block. It was not hostile silence. It was the silence of 2 men listening to the same orchestra and realizing they know different sections by heart. At the next corner, the light changed and the city rearranged them into the familiar geometry of waiting. A bus hissed to a stop and released a handful of the tired, the wired, the nowhere else to go. One of them was the scrubs-wearing woman they had seen earlier, now carrying a brown paper bag that had begun to give way to the wet. She caught Adrian's eye without meaning to, then looked through him with the polite oblivion of the hour. He stepped an inch to the left to make room for her shoulder. Victor stepped an inch to the right to give her path a wider sweep. They did it without looking at each other. It was the closest thing to prayer either of them practiced. "Tomorrow?" Victor said, when they'd crossed, making the word into something like a dare and something like a plan. "You'll show me. Tomorrow you will decide whether you want to be interesting or alive," Adrian said. "If you pick alive, come to the bridge with the bad graffiti at 3. If you pick interesting, I will read about you in paperwork." Victor's smile went half-cocked, the reflexive charm still wanting its pound of performance. Then it softened into something like agreement.
3, he said.
"I can do boring for an hour." "Try for a day," Adrian said. "And if you fail, try for an hour again." They stopped where their routes diverged, not because streets forced it, but because the night had made an angle for them, and they both recognized it. Victor gave a 2-fingered salute, more kindness than swagger this time, and slipped along the long edge of a shadow that would deposit him 2 blocks off, into a crowd leaving a late movie, into a tide that would obligingly lift him over the rough ground of his own impulses. Adrian watched him go long enough to be sure that he had chosen the safer set of eyes. Then he turned his face toward the river, toward the ironwork that sang to him, and toward the small work every city asks of its oldest ghosts. Behind them, the red door closed. A new batch of laughter popped like champagne. The bouncer dropped his cigarette and ground it with a boot. The rain ended as if a hand had smoothed the sky flat. The alley forgot its last story with the eagerness of a place glad to be useful again. Above, a camera stayed on for 3 seconds longer than it needed to, then slept. Chapter 3. Murmurs and Maps. Past midnight, the city sheds its stage makeup and shows the work beneath. Men in municipal green unspooling hoses across sidewalks, a pair of sanitation trucks grinding their teeth on plastic bags, a transit foreman in a hard hat kneeling to peer into a grate as if listening for an answer. The rain has slackened to a fine script, thin letters written across the air, but its afterword is everywhere. Pearls in the seams of manhole covers, a gloss on the flanks of buses, the glossiest sheen on the faces of the awake. Adrian walked the way mapmakers do when they lack paper, by inference, by the geometry of rumor. He kept time with the city service radio he wasn't carrying, the cadence of dispatch living in the bones after so long near it. The messages came like coughs, swallowed quickly, but they hung in the air long enough for a certain ear to parse. Male, mid-20s, under Regent Bridge, conscious but hypotensive, eyes glassy. No needle marks. Caller reports a woman collapsed on Orchard. Pulse fast. BP unstable. Says cold, but not cold. Private ambulance blew 3 red lights on 12th. Plate obscured. No siren. Janitor at 714 Pines reports something spilled on stair 12. Got most of it. Declining officer. Noise complaint near the South Rail spur. Caller mentions metal smell. Adrian translated each into an arrow, a distance, a pressure. Fear moves like electricity. It seeks ground. It takes the shortest path. It leaves a scent. Sloppy predators move by the same math. He set out along a route that would cross each report's last echo without appearing to, moving at a pace measured against bus schedules and cigarette breaks, letting the city's pulse pull him as steadfastly as the tide pulls boats that think themselves free. He felt the first boundary when the storefronts thinned and the streets themselves changed gait. Old brick, smaller panes of glass, set into frames that had been painted too many times the wrong color. Metal shutters scrawled with graffiti from the previous generation, a palimpsest under the new. This is where cities keep their older organs, pieces too expensive to replace, too sturdy to throw away. Pipes, conduits, tunnels, the arteries that carry what day life cannot see. He descended by degrees. Curb to gutter, gutter to ramp, ramp to stairs. The air cooled with the particular cool of places beneath policy. The damp smelled old, not rotten. Stones sweated rather than flesh. Light changed quality. It stopped being thrown by signage and began to be cast by bulbs that hummed an A just sharp enough to bother you. In the underlevel, the language shifts from advertisement to instruction. He passed signs that used to mean something, authorized personnel only, and meant something else now. NO1 looks here and less paid. The tile carried names of stations retired from service, as if the city had broken a few teeth and learned to smile without showing that side. The grout held a century of sorrow. Water made threads down the wall and collected in pans set by men with no union to represent them. Where the live lines shoot through like arteries, there are side corridors, little capillaries where the pressure is low, and the odd cells collect. He took one of those, stepping over a curl of cable left from a forgotten repair, ducking under pipes fat with heat or thin with neglect. He walked until the echo of his footfall stopped being his and became the building's. An irregular pattern in the ceiling where droplets measure time to their own metronome. He found the door by its refusal to exist in the place it occupied. On the surface, it was blank steel, paint matte and intact, handle bolted with the confidence of officialdom. But where official doors throw their authority outward, this one held itself inward like a breath. Around the jamb, the dust had a pattern, not from drafts or neglect, but from the traffic of cautious men who teach themselves not to brush a wall. A scuff at ankle height where a boot had pressed, not to wedge the door, but to hold it open without using fingers. A faint lift in the paint at the latch where tape had been placed, peeled, replaced. Adrian did not touch the handle. He pressed his palm flat to the panel and let the steel tell him what it had learned. Vibrations rose through skin into tendon and bone. A generator, not the buildings. The timbre was wrong. Throbbed in a room just beyond. Liquid shifted in containers in an uneven rhythm that spoke of human handling rather than machine. He felt air drawn and expelled by vents that had never been part of any permit. Under it all, the thin, almost imaginary tremor of voice, not words, but syllables in the throats of those who would keep quiet if given a shape to put their fear inside. The smell came like a chord, antiseptic first, the sharp top note that insists on cleanliness whether or not the thing itself is clean. Copper next, softened by plastic, paper and ink from labels handled a dozen times with the haste of commerce. The chalky back note of bodies held still for too long. He did not need his tongue to know the rest. The chalk mark was 3 doors down, not on this one. That's how they do it now. Never mark the door. Mark the place where you decide to go to the door. It wasn't language in any sense that could be taught in schools. It was habit, ritualized over a generation. 3 slashes, each a different length. The longest pointed to the door. The shortest pointed to a different exit. The middle slash indicated price or risk or the humor of the men who ran this place. Hard to tell. Animals leave scat. Men leave systems. Only the function matters. He could have gone in. He did not. He was not a cop and not a thief and not a saint. He was something cities grow when they're old enough to regret the first stories they told about themselves. Tonight, his job was not to break a door, but to draw the faintest pencil line around it on the city's invisible plan. He turned from the steel and the hum and the chalk to the staircase. He descended and took it back up like a man who always intends to meet a friend at ground level. The air changed to oxygen with a memory of rain in it. The hum of the generator became the hum of refrigeration over a deli case. The subway's long breath became the breath of a laundromat's dryers, spinning wet into warm with the monotonous heroism of machines. The laundromat's lights snapped the edges back on the world. The television in the corner showed a crime scene the camera had visited after everyone important had left. The reporter's umbrella caught the last of the drizzle and turned it into diamonds. Words like ritual and cult made quick work of nuance and got the job done. Deliver neat fear in the length of an ad break. A crawl of other fears scrolled below, like a choir humming harmony. People were there in the way people are there at that hour. An old woman blessing her socks with clothespins she refused to abandon to the past. A man asleep with his jaw slack and his hands folded on his belly, as if he were waiting for judgment. A college kid cramming notes between loads, highlighters skating careless neon across the page. A child's jacket turned inside out, its lining cherry printed. A pair of black jeans with the knees worn through sagged against the round window of the washer, like someone sighing. At the far end, near the broken change machine with the tape X across its mouth, a woman in a hood sat with a posture that looked like waiting and was not. She watched the glass of the front door more than the television. She watched the window glass reflections more than the people. When the dryer behind her took up a new rhythm, a sock slapping the porthole, her shoulders did not twitch. When the deli next door let its door shut too hard and the bell made a sound like a dropped spoon, the corner of her mouth moved half a millimeter. Not nerves, not boredom.
Counting.
Elara Voss. He did not have the name yet, but he recognized the type. The instrument you see after years of listening to the same orchestra. The oboe that always gets the A right. He had met her 100 times without ever meeting this person. A man with a notebook in a town that no longer exists. A woman standing too still at the edge of a field where a body will be found at dawn. A boy who knew which of his uncles to follow and which to call when it went the way it always goes. She did not hunt myths. She hunted the way harm repeats itself, because harming is lazy and cannot be bothered to invent new shapes. She looked at Adrian without looking. The glance landed a foot to the left of him and stayed there long enough to be the same as seeing. He offered her the only courtesy that fits that kind of work. He left before he could become a variable. The door's bell chimed softly, a sound civilized places trained into their entryways so that people will feel seen without the indignity of being surveilled. He went back to the street and listened to the city tune itself to a key he remembered from another life. This is the hour when the places that pretend to stay open late give up, and the places that promise to open early have not yet committed. The night staffed become the day staffed without ever being anyone who gets to clock out. The sky stopped trying to be anything but gray. He moved through blocks that performed their own forms of mercy. The diner that gave coffee to the man who was not paying. The cab driver who took the long way on purpose so the sleeping girl in the back seat could have another 8 minutes without the lights in her apartment reminding her she is alone. The cop who turned off his headlights on a quiet street because the deer that had wandered down from the park didn't need scaring. It is easy to hate cities if you only watch them when they are proud. Pride is when they are stupidest. Watch them when they are tired and doing their chores. Every few streets, the wrong note returned, fainter each time as rain diluted it, and trucks and time did the rest. He paused at Regent Bridge, and the smell of wet stone there tried to wrestle memory to the ground. He allowed it one pin, no more. Under the bridge, an EMT crew worked with the competence that looks like indifference if you've never needed it. A young man, a particular pallor that shows more when the light is fluorescent, sat braced against the column while a medic cuffed his arm and a second medic watched his eyes. The friend who had called 911 told the story twice too fast. The medics asked the questions they were trained to ask without letting any of their faces say the thing training makes language for. We think he'll live. The friend tearfully insisted people don't just like that, you know? The medic nodded, I know.
He did.
The gurney's wheels squeaked. That small rubber rub against the sidewalk that says, we have you. The young man did not meet Adrian's eyes. That was for the best. At Orchard, he passed a stoop whose steps had been mopped with vinegar and patience. The woman who had collapsed was gone now. In her place a salt outline, the kind left by water on stone, not by chalk on crime. A janitor in a building next door argued with a mop that would not obey. He had the air of someone who will find the thing others miss because he likes things to be quiet more than he likes to be right. Adrian's route took him, inevitably, toward the South Rail spur. The city there is ugly with usefulness. Chain link fence with the top row bent down and wired back on itself with the stubbornness of penny pinching. Weed trees doing their best through gravel. Pallets stacked to suggest art if you were drunk. The air carried diesel and the powdery dryness of bulk goods. Flour or lime or something else you would not want in your lungs. A guard in a box warmed his hands on a mug. He'd been told there was a noise complaint. He'd filed it mentally as rats. He would not go look. His job was to make a body where a job should be. The rails themselves were dead for the night. That doesn't mean they were safe. A sound came from the far side of the car's stack, faint, impatient. Camera tripods have a way of making a particular chitter when cheap hinges don't want rain. He leaned against a post and made his skeleton into patience. Skulkers arrive in 3 flavors. The ones who over-explain, the ones who pretend to be cigarette smoke, and the ones who set up. These were setters up. He let himself become background until they had installed themselves to their own satisfaction, until their whispers stopped being checklist and became story. When he stepped away, it was through a piece of darkness the camera could not be bothered with because it had chosen a different frame, a forklift track at the far gate, more cinematic. He walked until the cold on the river pleased him again. Bridges hum differently at night. The people who built them didn't know they were building instruments, but they did. Cars cross, the metal sings. If you lay a palm to the rail, you can feel the city traveling to itself. He put his hand there and counted buses from memory. This one always late by 3 minutes. This one always changes drivers at the far stop. This one announces stops 2 before and 1 after. Knowing this is not wisdom. It is citizenship of a particular kind. He thought about maps then, the kind people draw in books, and the kind that matter. The color map in London is a story people tell about how seeing correctly allows saving. They cite Dr. Snow and his dots and the pump. He had been there. He had watched people draw lines on paper and claim the lines made the difference when anyone with the right nose could have told you what the water tasted like. Dots matter. So, do noses. So, does the willingness to turn a story boring enough for the city to act on it. He took the chalk marks measure again in his head and placed it in relation to where Elara had sat counting, to where the private ambulance had cut lights, to where the janitor had decided no longer to be a janitor and had become, for a moment, a civic instrument. The outline on the stoop, the cuffs on the bridge, the generators hum underground. They made a triangle on no map anyone sells. He traced it with his thumbnail on the rail until the skin carried the grit of old paint. A gull cried, ugly and alive. Hollow metal echoed it back prettier, which is what cities do to everything that can stand a little improvement. He smiled and hated the word improvement in equal measure. He left the river with the same thrift he had brought to it and took a diagonal through a small park that closes in the way all parks close, symbolically with a sign, not physically, because cities know better than to pretend anyone stops kneading grass when the clock allows. A groundskeeper in a raincoat rode a cart along the path, checking nothing in particular, and thereby checking everything. 2 men under a gazebo made plans they would not share later. A woman jogged with a dog that wanted her to stop and smell the post where someone else had posted a memorandum in canine longhand. She did not. The dog made the note anyway. He brought himself back to the door below by way of a bodega that smelled of coffee and the sweet dry crumble of cereal boxes, of an apartment stoop where the intercom said names in a dozen languages that all meant child of someone, of a mural the rain had made better by smudging a corner the artist had failed to soften. He walked past the stairwell without pausing. He did not need to see it again to mark it. He catalogued instead the sightlines above, which windows had blinds, which had plants that could become spies, which had the dead look of Airbnb between renters. He marked the ladder on the adjacent brick. The bottom 2 rungs missing, replaced by an informal solution, the top rung slicker than it should be for a building no one lives in. He noted the drain that could be blocked to make a flood in the wrong place at the right time. Maps are not only for travel, they are for outcome. At a corner where the asphalt had split like old skin, he stopped because the air changed. The sound of the city drew itself into a tighter weave. He knew that sensation. Attention gathering like a school of fish. It meant someone else had pulled a string in the net. He could not see the hands, but he could feel the tension. Far above and across, on a building that had been a garment factory and then a co-working space and was now a mausoleum for ambitions bought by subscription. A camera drew a very slow breath. Not institutional gear. Musical almost. The rain made a circle in its frame and then ran off its hood in a bead that caught light like a truth briefly admitted. He watched it not watch him. He appreciated the discipline. Soon the net would cinch. He would try to make sure it caught the right fish and not the ones that keep the pond from going scummy. He let the city carry him to the edge of Dawn's rehearsal and stopped at a place where an all-night bakery's fans pushed warm sugar into the street. The baker inside tapped a tray with the edge of a hand the way a pianist tests a key. He pulled a rack of pastries from the oven and turned them with the reverse tongs grip that only comes from work. The sweet heat reached up and took the rain's last argument from the air. A woman in a hood, the same one from the laundromat or a different one with the same posture, passed him going the other way, phone under chin, saying, "No, don't send it yet.
Wait.
I want to be sure this is the right story." The words did not come to him as meaning, but as feel. A promise not to rush myth. He walked to the bridge with the bad graffiti and leaned his weight against the rail until the metal sang a note he could match. He didn't look at his reflection in the water because he knew how easily the mind can misunderstand a rippled face and call it destiny. He counted the buses again. Somewhere, a private ambulance idled a little too long with its lights off. Somewhere, a janitor propped a stairwell door with a bottle opener and decided to take pictures next time. Somewhere, a boy with a leather jacket lay on a couch not sleeping and told himself the word boring until it started to sound like discipline. The city held. It wasn't a guarantee. It was a posture. He took it with it. For now, that was enough. He turned inland again, toward the tallest empty thing in sight. He had felt the faint premonition that machines feel when a circuit is about to be closed. The net would pull tight soon. He wanted to be where the knots would strain. He wanted to bring a pair of scissors no one would see. Above him, Dawn tried a lighter shade of gray on the underside of the clouds and found it flattering. The rain, as always, pretended it had never happened. The streets, as always, made no promises. Adrian smiled like a man who has chosen the correct wrongs and walked on. Chapter 4: A City That Burned. The rain thinned until the city wore only the memory of water, and with that sense something older lifted from the river. Coal, faint but unmistakable, a taste of heat left over in the wind. It was nothing, a byproduct of power drawn downriver to keep night bright. And it was everything, a lever under Adrian's ribs that pried up a trapdoor in memory. Beneath the world he walked now, another street rose, narrower, made of stone that held chill like a grudge. Houses shouldered together for warmth, a bell that couldn't decide whether to summon or warn. He did not look different then, not enough for a painter to start a new canvas. The coat had been cut longer, the boots stitched with care by a man who signed his work in thread along the inner heel. He had a ring he never fiddled with, a discipline that convinced onlookers the ring mattered very much. He fed as a dilettante believes himself a connoisseur, apothecaries with ink-stained fingers, poets who drank bitterness to sweeten it in lines, widowers who talked to empty chairs until their throats begged for company. He took little, polished traces, wrapped with sentiment. He loved, he told himself, the serious. He told himself this made him harmless. The young are never merely hungry, they are loud. The three who undid the city, that winter would have been beautiful even had they stayed alive. Their collars were scandalously open to show the necks they no longer needed. Their laughter cut alleys into stages. They found a girl who wouldn't run, then another who couldn't, then a woman who should have had the right to walk home unremarked and did not. Rumors swelled like a bruise. Names were taken from one mouth and put into another with the efficiency of trade. Adrian should have left at the first dark puddle that reflected streetlight wrong. He did not. He told himself stories about obligations he didn't have. He told himself they would learn. When the baker's ovens overfired, when smoke walked the roof lines like a preacher, when the constable banged a staff on stone, and called the word that lets everyone volunteer righteousness. The city did not need truth. It needed a narrative with good posture. Men who owed too many men for too many things came into the square grateful for a debt they could finally pay. The old promise that violence could be virtue if done in harmony. The first door was nailed from the outside. The thump of the hammer sounded cheerful. The woman inside worked the bolts with a patience that deserted her only when the seam under her fingers grew warm. There is a moment when people understand that heat is not merely unpleasant but directional. The diaries call it panic. That word is too small. He should have broken the door. There are 100 reasons he did not. He had already learned invisibility enough to fear its loss. He had loved the apothecary in a manner that lies to itself about being loved. He knew that his intervention would not be rescue but revelation. He stood at the mouth of the street and felt the crowd's heat lean toward him like a question. He learned that night the difference between guilt and consequence. One is the song you sing to survive yourself. The other is the slow arithmetic of cities. On the bridge, the wind was colder. It combed the smoke into ribbons and laid them across the river like sashes. The boy with the kindling, 12, perhaps 13, shouldered a bundle too large for his bones. The rope bit his skin and left a bruise the shape of duty. He whistled. Adrian can still hear the tune, jaunty, repetitive, suitable for a long task, carrying fire as if it needed encouragement. The boy passed close enough that a hand could have reached, could have taken the weight, could have made a different argument to history. Adrian did not move. There is a species of cowardice, so well rationalized it passes for strategy. He keeps that night polished in him, so he will know its texture when the same weather blows in, smelling of coal under rain. Morning after a burning is its own theology. Ash pretends to be snow. Men sweep with enviable sincerity, as if cleanliness could be retroactive. The bakers opened early, because bread is apology in the only grammar most people can read before dawn. Adrian bought loaves because men whose ovens survived needed to be given something to do besides remember. He put the ring in his pocket that day because there is a point after which sentiment is fashion and fashion gets you noticed. The gate, black at the edges as if history had drawn around it with charcoal, let him out without asking questions. Cities forgive departures so long as they're graceful. What he kept after he shed coats and names was subtraction. It is a philosophy, and it is a craft. Subtract flourish. Subtract the urge to be understood. Subtract the appetite for being central to any narrative but your own. Add punctuality. Add exact change. Add the habit of being seen carrying something heavy down a stair for someone old, without requiring anyone to remark on the feet learn the shadow behind the pillar that has never yet caught a camera's eye. Learn to smile like a man half certain he is late to an appointment he does not care about. Study the ways doors behave, which ones sigh when they close, and which ones click with satisfaction. If you must be noticed for a quality no one retells. Reliability, quietness, a face that appears in memory only as there was someone behind me, I think. He practiced in cities that do not exist now except as adjectives. A port where rats moved with the grace of information. A capital where candles wore collars of paper to keep wax off the sleeves of men who made laws about fear. A factory town that taught him the sound of 1,200 bodies changing shifts at once. Gaslight taught him about angle. Arc light taught him about distance. Neon taught him that color can be camouflaged if you stand where it is rudest. He learned to read the newspapers not for story, but for appetite. He watched the century invent cameras, then invent reasons to put them everywhere. He learned the trick of letting lenses find his jawline but not his intention, of keeping his neck a column of light, and his eyes in weather of their own. When cards with names replaced the handshake, he learned to be the man whose card ran out yesterday. When cards with stripes replaced cards with names, he learned to be cash. When cash went quiet and numbers moved along rails no one could see, he learned to be present at the point where a man needs a door held more than he needs an alibi. None of that makes you good. It makes you durable. He did not claim the word good for himself. He built in its place a modest structure called Less Harm. It is not a cathedral. It is a series of lintels against weather. There were exceptions. There was a winter when a tailor's apprentice went missing in a district that would not miss him. Adrian left a note in the pocket of a coat that arrived, by innocent paths, on the right table at the right hour. There was a summer when cholera took a street, and a man with a pencil drew dots, and everyone remembers the dots, and no one remembers the taste of the pump water, and Adrian remembers both. He does not tell that story at parties he does not attend. In the blackout that made the city bruise purple and joyous in the wrong neighborhoods and afraid in the ones that have learned to buy fear early, he walked 4 miles with a stranger holding his sleeve because she had lost her glasses. She thanked him as if gratitude were a tip. He went back out into the heat and counted the generators by the notes their engines played. There were nights when boredom saved more lives than courage. He came to revere boredom the way other men revere revelation. Revelations write laws. Boredom writes memos. Memos keep the ambulances funded. This is why Victor's grin offended him so personally. Not because the boy wanted to live loudly, that is the right of the living, but because loudness enlists crowds. Crowds remember special effects. Crowds make myths. Myths become ordinances in the mouths of men who will never be in the alley where the ordinance lands, who will never wipe blood with a bar rag while a bouncer measures the distance between his license and his conscience. He walked now beneath the skyline that had learned to be glass. The after-rain light made each pane a page, and on each page the city wrote the same story. Do what you can until you can't. Forgive yourself just enough to work again tomorrow. A delivery driver parked where he should not, unloaded speed as apology, and was forgiven by the curb because the curb understood breakfast. A woman in a blazer too new for her shoulders wrote a text with the dignity of a person who lies well only to spare someone else. A boy in a hoodie put a paper-wrapped sandwich under his jacket as if it were a warm animal. The baker behind the counter pretended not to see. They were all conducting the ordinary crime of mercy. Coal receded from the air. The river gave back its metal smell. He let the present reassert itself 1 cent at a time. Detergent from a window where someone drew a wet sleeve across glass. Hot breaks. The skins of oranges. Penny on the tongue ozone from a transformer in a state of small complaint. It anchored him in the hour he was obliged to serve. He had paid for his education in earlier hours. The debt was ongoing, but its interest could be managed if he kept nights like this one from becoming pageants. He paused at the foot of a tower so empty it had learned to hum its loneliness. The wind came through broken panes and played the floors like an organ, notes spaced by stairwells and vents, sustained by steel. Inside, at a height that made ambulances sweat, men and women were hammering a set into a trap and calling it a plan. He could feel it in the pressure of the air, the way a building holds its breath when too many people enter with intention. He thought of Elara, not as a savior, but as a function. Every century writes a better immune system for the same disease. In hers, the fever would break not in torches, but in forms to be signed, in procedures to be followed, in a press conference deliberately boring enough to starve the myth. He did not love bureaucracy. He loved what it prevented. He would help her because helping her meant denying fire a song. He would not ask her to forgive him for the bridge, or the door, or the ring. Neither of them had time to be absolved. He thought of Victor, who had stood in rain and asked for a rule with the half-smile of a boy making fun of himself before the world could. He could feel the weight of the boy's jacket in his hand from the stairwell tomorrow hadn't reached yet. He could feel the give of concrete under footfalls that did not yet exist. He could smell, absurdly, the sweetness of an energy drink left behind by a tech who would step on it and swear. He could predict the angle of the first ultraviolet lamp and the way it would find a shape to hang its meaning on, because that is what light does when you force it to be language. He entered the building by the door the wind liked best and walked the stair that machines had not yet bullied into compliance. Old dust has a texture under the palm that fresh dust does not. He let it mark him. At a landing he stopped and laid his ear to the rail. Tension moved through steel like rumor, faster than truth, and infinitely more persuasive. He followed it up until his knees remembered a century when they had been asked to do this too often, and informed him of their grievances. On the maintenance floor, the city arrived in drafts. The smell of wet concrete, of spooled cable, of the particular chemical cleanliness of mopped dirt. The room was already a diagram. Pillars offered angles. Puddles promised reflections. The doors wrote their own map. This one hinges left. That one gives a fraction early. This one will jam when asked. He walked the edges like a man measuring a stage for a play he does not want to see, but must not allow to close on blood. For a moment, one sincere moment, he wished to be someone else. Someone allowed a single spectacular gesture that blew a fuse in the plan, scattered pawns, reset a board.
He had seen men like that.
They died early and left behind narratives that required too many bodies to carry. He let the wish pass. He counted exits. He traced the path the drone would take if it came in ambitious and left embarrassed. He placed Victor where a boy would choose to stand for maximum self-regard and moved that point 3 steps into the dark with the simple device of a suggestion he would make later, in a tone that sounded like criticism and was mercy. The city below sent up a new note. Sirens braided around a block like ribbon around a maypole. The weather system was gathering. He set his posture to intercept, not stop.
To turn, not break.
It is impossible to teach a boy not to be himself. You can only teach him where to stand when himself becomes a hazard. He put his hand on a concrete pillar and felt the chill draw heat from his skin. He remembered the apothecary's door, the hammer, the heat moving through it toward a woman's understanding. He remembered the boy's whistled tune, the bruise on the shoulder. He let the memory burn clean this time, without smoke, and then he stacked it neatly where he keeps such things to take out later and check against the present. The city deserves that much. A witness willing to be bored by his own past if boredom keeps the future from having to rehearse it. Wind sang in the windows. His jaw unclenched. He thought about bread and binders and the small courage of people who do the dull work that holds scenes intact. He imagined Elara's plant on a sill, failing under office light, and the tenderness with which she would water it anyway. He imagined Victor's face when he discovered that the rule he hated most had saved him. He imagined nothing grander than a night that ended with a mop and a report. A camera across the street blinked a slow, reptile blink. He turned his face to catch only the edge of it. The city offered him its next page. He did not try to skip ahead. He placed his feet where history had taught him the floor holds and waited for the weather to arrive. Chapter 5, The Blood Market. The staircase smelled like a basement childhood might remember if childhoods ever ended in basements. Damp concrete, dust that had learned to be patient, an undertone of metal that never decided whether to be comforting or cruel. Adrian took it with the unhurried feet of a man going to check a fuse, one hand trailing the handrail because rails remember what walls forget. For landings down, the building changed. You could feel it in the way the air took on an inland tide, the push-pull of ventilation not on any architect's drawings. The hum of a generator seeped through steel like heat through the bones of a stove. The door posed as official, black gray, municipal. But official doors dressed to be noticed, and then obeyed. This one was nothing but its own temperature. It held its breath. The paint near the latch had lifted and settled in tiny scales where tape had lived and died. At ankle height, a scuff left by a boot toe that knew exactly how a panel resists when a hand needs to remain clean. 3 chalk marks, 3 doors along, never the door itself, cut short lines into the grime. One angled toward an exit no one should take in a hurry, one toward a corridor nobody photographs well, one pointing here with the offhand acceptance of categories. Cheap, quick, quiet. He entered on rhythm, not code. 2 soft taps with the ball of the fist, a wait long enough to test patience, 1 longer tap, a pause that let the hallway remember it had walls. The catch unlatched with a sigh, the sigh of something used often and never thanked. Inside, a platform retired from civic duty and repurposed for commerce, as all good ruins are. The tiled name of a dead station peeled in a beautiful, melancholy scroll above folding tables. Portable four-poles stood like spindly trees whose leaves were neatly bagged. A pair of contractor lamps threw their pitiless glow, turning faces into paperwork. Coolers hummed in polite competition with the generator. Tarps hummed to make rooms that were not rooms, curtains that suggested privacy the way stage sets suggest walls. The smell made a chord. Antiseptic's top note, a Swedish iron mid. The chalk-dry bass of fear caught and held. A woman in a scrub top. Mariel, the tag said in marker. Manage the flow with the gentleness of someone who has learned that terror decreases if you speak to people not like cattle or criminals, but like neighbors. She talked hands through fists, showed forearms the tape, used a language of practical care. Cold? I have a blanket. Dizzy? Keep your eyes on that sign. Don't look down. A man with a salesman's posture emceed an auction in a voice that had sold used cars in daylight. Oh, positive in quantity. A negative scarce tonight. AB a novelty we can charge you more for. His grin was not evil. It was a man pleased to be good at something. That made it worse. There were the buyers who wore their hunger like expensive cologne. Self-aware, certain that their appetites were artisanal rather than animal. There were the ones who had never forgiven the world for humiliating them and preferred to be feared by someone. There were the tourists pretending to be locals. And there were the dead, some newly, some not. Moving among them with the invisible poise of water through pipes. Adrian knew their tells and avoided them. He had not come to be recognized by kind. Victor had. He stood at the edge of the light with the easy posture of a boy at a party who knows he's dressed correctly. The leather had dried since the rain, and now shone in a way that could be mistaken for money. He laughed with the auctioneer at a line that deserved only silence, and for a moment he seemed younger than he wore himself. Courier work, he told a man at his elbow, trying on a trade like a hat. Routes. I can learn routes. You won't find anyone faster. Fast is only good if you're quiet, the man said without looking at him. I can be boring, Victor said, and the way he said it made the word almost glamorous. Adrian drifted closer, the way a draft arrives, present but not naming its source. He took in the geometry of the room, where the camera would go if a camera came, where a man who wanted to run would accidentally force himself to a stop, where a drone would hit a duct and spin into a fool's halo. He learned a gate of the generator, so he would know if it was changed for another later. He clocked faces with the care and account uses for zeros. One doubled at the wrong and can ruin a quarter. Victor felt him, the way one instrument hears another tuning. He didn't turn at first. He liked the sensation of being aware, while pretending not to be. Then he did, eyes skimming with practiced laziness until they fixed. You again, he said, a grin flickering. Showtime. Come to buy etiquette? We only sell in bags. Leave the city, Adrian said, or learn to be quiet in it. This ends in paperwork you will mistake for bonfires. Victor's mouth tilted, unwilling to give the line the respect of seriousness. You hate this because it makes us visible, he said, glancing around with the satisfaction of a boy who has found the room adults whispered about. I like it because it's honest. It is retail, Adrian said. Retail is never honest. It only wears honesty, like a name tag. Mariel's scrub top looked up at them then, a single precise look that took their measure the way a seamstress measures a hem. 2 points, a hand's breadth decision. She smiled at Victor not as at a customer or a threat, but as at a nephew who might clean up nice if someone cared. You look like you could carry boxes, she said. Depends what's inside, Victor answered, instantly charming. Paper, she said. Paper is always inside the things you don't expect. He took the stack. The weight surprised him. Paper carries a heaviness its texture does not confess. Labels, forms, consents that consent to nothing. He balanced them on his forearm and looked for a heartbeat like a man who might have had a different job. Adrian stood near the auctioneer long enough to hear the cadence of his numbers. The favorite jokes, the pivot into sincerity he used when declaring a charity price for donors in need. He watched how the crowd pushed toward him when he lifted a bag and how they shrank when he mentioned a type they did not fancy, because even monsters have palates. He wondered, as he always did, whether disgust was a luxury or a compass. He decided, tonight, to treat it as a warning bell rather than a verdict. He found the exit he would want to take if the room were to fill with light. He filed it away. He timed the lull between the generator's breath and the coolers. That was when you could move with least notice. He measured the distance to the door that led farther in, beyond the tarps, where the donors sat in airline seats with blankets over their knees, eyes cast down to the little televisions of their own hands, and set a hard, invisible line. He would not cross it. He had made himself promises about what he would witness and what he would refuse. Victor returned the forms, dripping easy gratitude. He had learned already that praise lubricates nights. He arrived within arm's length of Adrian with a look that conceded what the mouth would not. This is bigger than my joke. You are right, he conceded aloud, as if admitting a plot hole. There are maps here, people following them. And people drawing new ones, Adrian said, letting his chin lift toward the ceiling until even Victor understood. The lens. Somewhere up and away, it blinked in the way expensive lenses do when they resent rain. Victor did not drop his gaze or try to hide. That failure was honest. He liked the idea of being in a frame. He always had. It was the first habit Adrian intended to break in him, not by shaming it, but by offering him a better sophistication, the art of never quite resolving into focus. He thought of a painter's underdrawing, lines that guide, and then vanish under color. That is what the boy would need to be if he wanted to live in this. Lines that help the city make a better picture without ever insisting on becoming the subject. You could teach me, Victor said. It came out softer than he meant. I could make you lonely for your own good, Adrian said, which is the same thing. From the far end of the platform came a sound like a hard rain on tin. Not a storm, a rehearsal. Metal folding chairs being set in rows. The market plan to talk. Safety, community, the narrative. A word that tastes good to people who sell beer in sanitized vats. A thin man with a clipboard moved his mouth in time, with a litany only he could hear. He gestured at a makeshift lectern. Posters, community help, safe donation, cash paid, went up on boards with the width of staples. People love legitimacy when committing crimes. It is bomb and bait both. Adrian eased toward the periphery. If a speech was coming, a raid was near. Raids like speeches. Cameras like both.
He touched a post as he passed.
Vibrations come through iron faster than through rumor. Someone above repositioned weight. Men, gear, a hierarchy. He felt the building tense as a horse does when reins are pulled without kindness. He found Mariel again at the edge of her work. You should be elsewhere, he said. She looked at him as if she had heard a clock say her name. And you, she asked. I am a rumor, he said. Rumors stay clear of headlines. She gave him a patient, amused look that implied she'd met men who mistook riddles for character. Tomorrow, she said to the air instead, as if moving the question forward would transform it. Tomorrow I'm at St. Zita, upstairs, under a fluorescent light that hums. If anyone asks, I'll be there. If no one does, I'll still be there. Good, he said. She passed him a pair of nitrile gloves, blue. Not because he needed them. Because it mattered to her that all hands looked clean in this place, even if only for a minute. Victor had drifted back to the auction, bored of logistics, hungry for narrative. He raised a bid with a flair that made the auctioneer praise his discernment in choosing what was not rare but was, tonight, fashionable. Even exceptional hunger wants to be seen as taste. Adrian's lip twitched, the closest he would give the room to contempt. He touched Victor's sleeve. Shift, he said quietly.
Now.
Victor had not yet learned to obey the tone that saves lives. He opened his mouth to enjoy defiance. The chair clatter ratcheted louder. A cooler fan kicked. Overhead, a lens drank rain and focused. Adrian did not grip hard. He did not persuade. He merely began to move in a direction and made the space around Victor asymmetric enough that the boy followed rather than be awkward. No one likes to be awkward. It is how you shepherd in a crowd. They reached the door that pretended not to be a door, the one almost flush with tile, hinge hidden in shadows. It delivered them to a narrow stair well enough maintained to say someone had an arrangement with someone. On the fourth step, Victor stopped with that sudden stiffness that means a body is learning an animal lesson. "You smell it too?" he asked. "Light," Adrian said. "You can smell light?" "You will," Adrian said. "The kind that burns without heat." He thought of Elara then, though he still did not have her name. He thought of what it costs a person to be the one who carries a quiet oath into rooms with louder men. He thought of paperwork fluttering in fluorescent hum, of cheap coffee, of insurance riders for volunteers with more conviction than health coverage. He admired boredom again, extravagant with it in this moment, a spendthrift with a currency no one thinks they want until they need it. In the stairwell's mouth, the market spread behind them like a dream you can't retell. The glamour and the absurdity and the efficient cruelty. Ahead, the building woke with the premonition of heatless sun. Adrian took the step that would put them on a level with weather and not with story. Victor took it with a small, stifled laugh. The laugh of a boy who realizes he has almost done something irreversible and isn't sure whether he is proud or ashamed. Above, the city gathered its instruments. Somewhere a woman with a hood and a pen checked her battery level and her tone. Somewhere a drone swabbed the air and found it brisk. Somewhere the man with the clipboard rehearsed lines about community and safety that would become exhibits, then footnotes, then myths, then less. Adrian put his hand briefly on the boy's back, mid-spine, like a blessing that pretends to be a shove. They went up. Behind them, the auctioneer lifted a bag and told a joke that made half the room laugh on schedule. Mariel taped a tube to a forearm with the neatness of a ribbon on a gift. The generator coughed once and apologized with a stronger hum. The platform held its breath. The door relatched behind them with a whisper. The city exhaled. The weather arrived. Chapter 6, The Hunters. They did not call themselves hunters because hunter invites the wrong romance and the wrong enemies. On paper, they were volunteers with an after-hours nonprofit attached by a thin braid to a municipal department that preferred not to have to explain how it made decisions. Their mission statement was a collage of words the city likes to see on invoices: resiliency, community, outreach, safety. Their office sat above a shuttered call center that still carried the stale breath of scripts. Ceiling tiles bowed with old leaks. Coffee went bitter at the edges of the pot and then turned proud of it. Elara Voss stood at the whiteboard like a woman who has learned that attention is a finite resource and plans to spend hers frugally. She wore boots that told floors they could stop trying to betray her and a jacket that had lost its newness with relief. On the wall behind her, maps had been punctured into quilt by pins and thread. The colors were not romantic. They were sensible. Yellow for rumors that refused to stay rumors, blue for calls that sounded like copycats, red for nights a hospital reported something and a janitor agreed. Small sticky notes carried ugly truths in tidy handwriting. She did not save them for archives. She threw them out when they were done. Myth loves souvenirs. Work doesn't. Her team was small enough to remember birthdays and large enough to be able to take a sick day without leaving a hole you could get hurt in. Two techs whose hair bore the permanent dent of headphones worked with care you could mistake for shyness. A former EMT who trusted his memory more than paperwork. A woman who ran a community fridge by day and had learned more about night weather in a year than the city had taught itself in 10. A man who had lost a nephew and who had taught himself, by an act of love so stubborn it bordered on madness, to be calm in rooms that did not deserve it. Elara tapped the map once with the capped end of a pen and brought the room's noise down without raising her voice. "We're not here to be dramatic," she said. "We are here to have a professional argument with harm until harm gives up from boredom. It was not a line. She believed it. The drone footage, last week's rain, a tilted sky, played on a screen that cost less than some weddings spend on cake. It watched the dead platform entrance without judging it. The algorithm had been taught to care about faces, but Elara had taught the algorithm to care about posture and repetition instead. That is how you see men like the Angle, who never give the face, but always leave the trace. She watched the way the door took people in a one-by-one rhythm, the way shadows handled themselves before choosing direction. An excited boy with a gift for being looked at, a woman who moved heavy things with the quiet of a practiced back, the obliging blur that comes when a person wants to be invisible and picks the wrong kind of invisibility. The Angle walked the frame without landing in it. How do you catch someone who doesn't resolve? A tech asked. Not whined. Asked, as if at a blackboard. You don't, Elara said. You catch the harm they orbit. She had an ancestor who wrote about a man on a bridge. He had described heat, not faces. She kept the diary in a drawer she rarely opened. It kept her honest about the distance between a story and a plan. They build a plan with the dignity of people who expect plans to fail a little. Permits. Real ones. The kind that let you unlock doors and stand on roofs without making liars of your colleagues. A conversation with a building owner who would prefer future plans to current compliance and was willing to pay with access. A set of ultraviolet lamps, legal to own, useful for making a room decide what it wants to be. Rounds machined by a shop that made parts for medical devices, not because silver is a romance-worth metal, but because the metallurgy was trustworthy in other ways. Cameras whose fields overlapped like the scales of a fish. A path for civilians that would function regardless of anyone's heroics. She wrote 3 emails with subject lines so boring even people with power would read them. She called a deputy commissioner who owed her the favor of not sending uniforms with itchy reputations. She rehearsed a press statement in which the city would accomplish the remarkable, address fear without rewarding it. Then she crossed out the most forceful sentence and replaced it with a duller one that would survive the second-day questions. Her team asked the questions that keep humans human in rooms like this. What if the guy with the clipboard runs? Do we seize the coolers first? What if donors are present? Do we have blankets? The woman from the community fridge had a face that answered before Elara could. We always have blankets, she said. Elara stood at the window to rest her eyes. The city made shapes in glass. A man carrying pizza boxes as if they were gifts. A girl crossing a wide street with the arrogance of youth and the agility of practice. A couple rehearsing a fight. She felt the old hum of the diary in her, bridge, boy, tuned, but had trained herself to let it be a hum and not a drum. Revenge is a storyline. She needed plumbing. They looked at the tower that would be the room for tonight's argument. The top floor had pride nobody had paid for. Windows had been kicked out by men with boots and boredom. The wind made a music that dignified neglect. Its stairs were a compromise between a ladder and a suggestion. It was perfect in the way bad ideas often are. Easy access for you, easier exits for nobody, clean lines for cameras to draw a narrative on later, distances long enough to tire heroes and short enough to make mistakes feel inevitable. Positions, Elara said, not a call to battle, a call to attention. They packed gear that looked less glamorous than it would on the news and felt heavier than the budget described. They signed things with the pens people leave in bowls by accident. They counted batteries. They bickered about whether a sandwich eaten now would cause regret later. They checked in a dozen small ways that they were not being watched by the wrong eyes. When the sky went a shade lighter than it had any right to be, they went out. On the way, in a van that had no business looking official, Elara closed her eyes without sleeping. She thought of the years she had spent learning to be calm when a door opens and people find what they came for. She thought of the hours she had spent in rooms where men like speeches pretend plans are speeches with uniforms. She thought of the way her father had taught her to make tea and not talk for the first 5 minutes because first words are often the wrong ones. She promised herself to speak late and lightly. They reached the base of the tower. Wind came down like water. The building sighed. The team unspooled themselves into place, not with the crisp showmanship of a unit performing competence, but with the gentle friction of a crew that has done heavy things together often enough to be quiet. Cameras blinked green, then steady. Lenses wore hoods like monks' pipe bowls. The UV lights waited like false dawn. The medic checked himself 4 times and found himself ready only on the 5th. The EMT touched the blanket bag as if it were a talisman. The community fridge woman tucked her hair behind her ear and set her mouth the way mothers do before telling truths in rooms where someone else folds the paper. Elara climbed the stairs with the knowledge that stairs do not forgive knees, and did not complain about it. At the landing, she held a hand out for anyone to take if they needed. No one did, and she did not feel insulted. On the floor below the maintenance level, she stopped and let her palm flatten to a door. Vibrations traveled, not through steel this time, but through drywall and malice. The market above moved in chairs, in jokes, in plans. She put her ear to the seam and heard the sound arrogance makes when it tests its microphone. Check, check. She moved her team like a tactician who has the luxury of a moral. No heroics, she said, and the word meant pay attention to the ordinary. She assigned a pair to the exit nobody marks because it looks like it doesn't go anywhere. She set a man with patient hands at the choke point where a camera would otherwise tell a worse story later. She checked the sight lines not for beauty, but for proof. Then she felt it. The snap the city makes inside itself when 2 weather systems collide. Up in that room, 2 men had found each other. One who thinks he is learning to be legend. One who has spent hundreds of nights insisting on being seen, not pattern. They would complicate her plan. They would also save it. She wished, not for the first time, that coordination weren't the ugliest word for partnership. She wished, not for the first time, that she could turn the city off and on again like a router. On my mark, she said. The lamps opened without drama. The room's color changed to a Spectrum phone's wooden honor. The air went flat, then sharp. People shouted, surprised, not wounded. Somewhere a generator forgot to be brave and coughed. Somewhere a man with a bright jacket remembered his training, and then remembered his debts and chose training. A drone came hopeful and left humbled by a duct. A bag split, lurid as a party accident, and someone whose job was to be unfazable mopped with the competence that deserves a raise. Elara walked into the light like a woman stepping onto a stage she'd rather sweep than play on. She kept her hands live but empty. She saw faces. She saw postures. She saw the door to the stairwell move and did not go, because attention is finite, and hers was needed here. In the middle of the room, a drum tipped toward a woman's leg. Elara stepped. It was nothing, a reflex, and another body was there first, lifting, flipping, arranging gravity to obey compassion. She met a pair of eyes that had weather in them and took the measure. Not ally, not enemy, not myth. Variable. She stored the variable in the place where she keeps the things she can admit later. Blankets, she said. The woman from the fridge was already throwing them. Names, said the EMT. Clipboards, someone answered bitterly, then did it anyway. They did not catch everyone. You never do. But within the span of a decent song, they had made the room decide what it wanted to be. Not a market, not a story. A scene to be cleaned and catalogued. The auctioneer's voice, robbed of microphone, learned humility. Mariel tied off a line without shaking and looked at Elara like women look at each other in rooms that have earned neither of them. Paperwork assembled itself as if every sheet were seeking the comfort of another. Elara gave the line she had promised herself to give, and not the sharper one she had written first. We are here for safety, she told a camera, because if you don't give them something, they will invent it. If you are cold, we will warm you. If you are afraid, we will stay. It was not inspiring. It was a memo. She was proud of it. Off to one side, out of the reach of the lamp's most arrogant beam, 2 men, the boy and the angle, moved in a geometry Elara did not interfere with. The older touched the younger's jacket and shoved, not unkind. The door closed. It did so with the sound of a plan that would go on not meeting in rooms like this, but in the seams between. She did not know yet how much that would help her work. She knew only that harm loves attention, and that any man who makes less noise than he could is, for the moment, useful. They finished not with applause, but with brooms. The city's best victories end that way. She supervised the first load down the stairs herself, because an exit is always the most vulnerable part of a night. The wind in the broken windows had learned a new tune, a lighter one. The building stopped holding its breath. On the sidewalk, in air that remembered rain only as rumor, Elara and her crew started to look like normal people again. The camera that had watched from across the way blinked its tired reptile blink and went home to be edited. Volunteers took off vests with the relief of shedding borrowed authority. Someone made a joke about sandwiches. They laughed more than it deserved, because laughing is how you put the lid back on the hour. Elara stood with her hand on the van's door and stared at nothing in particular until the nothing became a shape she could file under. Done enough. She did not look up at the roof, where a man might be catching his breath beside a boy who had nearly chosen a worse lesson. She did not allow herself the sentiment of imagining them safer than they would be. She pulled the door. It shut with an honest clunk. Back in the office with bad coffee and an alive plant losing the argument anyway, she wrote sentences dull enough to be believed. She attached 3 photographs no one would want to look at and 5 that television would love. She sent the package to people who only ever thank you in budget season. She laid her pen down and let her shoulders go. Outside, the city took the story and did what it always does. Retold it in kinder voices than it deserved and meaner ones too, then put it on a shelf. Inside, Elara thought of the diary she almost never opened, and of bridges, and of boys, and of the difference between seeing a fire and keeping one from forming. She got up, watered the failing plant with tenderness it could not use, and went home to sleep the way you sleep, when what you stopped was not the world, but something ugly that would have made it worse. Dawn flirted. Somewhere under stone and grime, chalk dried into its same 3 marks. Somewhere above, a lens dried, too, and remembered nothing of what it had seen except what someone would later ask it for. Somewhere between, a man who loved boredom and a boy who hated it descended a stair in a room that smelled of adrenaline and antiseptic and learned, between breaths, how to stay. They had the weather for it. For now. Chapter 7, The Skyscraper. The empty tower stairwell was an esophagus swallowing night. Damp concrete brushed shoulders with a cool insistence. The smell was of rust and old copier toner, of rain that had wandered in and decided to stay. Adrian climbed without hurry. He placed his hand on the rail, as if reminding the building that men could still be gentle with it. Each landing offered a square of darkness framed in metal. The city outside played a thin organ song through broken panes, wind making music out of vacancy. At the maintenance level, the door stuck a fraction and then yielded with a sound like a throat clearing. The room beyond was a cathedral to unfinished intentions. Pillars like stone trunks, cables coiled in sleeping knots, puddles that held the city upside down in their black mirrors. A few tarps had been strung into insincere walls. Someone had rolled out a lectern, the kind rented for presentations about synergy and market share, and planted it on the naked slab. A coil of extension cords trailed away like the shed skin of a brighter future. Victor stood near a pillar, putting his weight on one leg the way boys do when they wish to appear careless and composed. He had acquired, between basement and tower, a look of having been chosen by the room, by the night, by whatever story was about to be told. Men with the lanyard posture of small authority worked cables and chairs. The auctioneer from the tunnel had become a host, rehearsing the cadence of welcome. Mariel moved through it all with the tired grace of someone who will choose triage over doctrine every time. "You came," Victor said without turning, the way a student notices a teacher's presence in the way of a room before he registers the person. "Thought you might be allergic to heights." "I'm allergic to headlines," Adrian said. "Heights merely let them form faster." Victor's grin tightened. "Show me where to stand." He did, not with a lecture, but with the calculus of angles his body carried from other nights. "Here," he said, tapping the concrete with the toe of his shoe, "and then here when the light becomes language. Avoid reflections you didn't choose. Keep your face a rumor. Keep your hands visible. People forgive hands." Victor tried the posture, this unchoreography. He looked like a dancer learning stillness. "And if I decide to be brave, bravery is what people call it when you make their story more interesting," Adrian said. "Try usefulness." The city gathered itself around them. You can feel it. Pressure tightening in the spaces between noises. A hush that doesn't belong to quiet so much as to the moment before weather arrives. The lens across the street blinked, and its blink was a decision. Somewhere below, Elara's careful boredom unfolded into positions. The doorway breathed out a draft that smelled faintly of ozone and the rubber of new gear. The first ultraviolet lamp opened like a new species of sunrise, colorless and absolute. It washed the room into a spectrum that human eyes distrust and bodies obey. A second lamp answered from a different angle, and the two made a geometry that turned up truth where darkness had been arranging its own facts.
Shouts.
The chair legs scraped constellation. A cooler cracked its voice into the air. The auctioneer tried to make his tone into leadership and discovered it was only volume. People who had believed themselves discreet became suddenly very specific. "This is where my left foot is. This is where my right hand reaches. This is what I am willing to step on to be somewhere else." Drones dipped in with an insect whir, and found ducks, learned humility, spun out. Victor's body went to its oldest grammar: expand, defend, present. The lamps made of him a statue no one had commissioned. Adrian's hand found the back of his jacket and moved him with the courtesy a driver reserves for a passenger when avoiding a pothole. "Not clever," he said in Victor's ear. "Alive." "Where?" Victor demanded, a low animal sound behind the word. Adrian put him in the shadow, where a pillar's shoulder broke the lamp's insistence. "Here you are not a narrative. Here you are the scene." Across the room, a drum tipped toward a woman's shin. Mariel went to it and couldn't lift its weight. Elara reached it at the same moment as another body. Adrian recognized his own, arriving in a place he had not decided to travel to. He lifted and flipped. The woman's leg returned to belonging to her. Elara met his eyes with a look that contained neither gratitude nor accusation. It contained the accounting of variables. The UV beam crossed Adrian's jaw like blessing and indictment both. He angled his face so the light found only edge. He memorized the path the beam had taken to arrive here. The lamp's height, the hand that carried it, the tendency of the carrier to tilt right when excited. He filed it for later, a notation on a score he might have to play again. A man ran for the wrong door. The wrong door obliged by sticking. Another man decided to courageous himself into a mistake and discovered his courage didn't fit the room. Mariel wrapped an arm in a blanket instead of a story. Good choice. The clipboard man discovered that clipboards break in half when stepped on. "Now," Adrian told Victor, voice thin and taut as piano wire. They moved in the lulls between the building's breaths. Generator hum. Cooler exhale. Drone whir, crossing behind pillars, slipping through the elbow space of men with jobs. Adrian did not grip Victor. He arranged him the way fingers arrange fabric, a series of gentle insistences. Twice he altered their path to avoid a reflection in a puddle where the drone's camera had chosen to admire itself. At the stairwell, a trio of bodies shoved in panic and achieved the result panic deserves. Stuck. Adrian kissed the wall with his shoulder and found the thin lip of darkness between fear and architecture. "Flatten," he told Victor, and the boy obeyed with the gameness of someone who had learned the trick 2 hours ago and discovered he could be good at it. They slipped through, a seam in a garment that holds. The stairwell smelled of dust warmed by adrenaline. From below came the heavier footfalls of men trained in staircase geometry. Left shoulder to the wall, breath measured to steps, light held high. Adrian taste-tested their intentions from the air. Duty, worry, an unglamorous hope to get through a shift without becoming an anecdote. "Don't run," he said. "Running teaches the wrong witness the wrong lesson about you." Victor's breath came fast, then learned how to exit without noise. "You hate running?" "I hate what people think they see when you do it," Adrian said. They reached the landing with a window that had lost its temper in a storm 2 summers ago. The wind had opinions here. It pushed and pulled, insisting the city had agreed to be river. Adrian measured the jump in his mind, the sill to the maintenance scaffold, and discarded it. Drama cost extra in paperwork. "We go down," he said, choosing the duller route. On the floor below, the hum of the raid turned tinny through concrete. Voices became artifacts, clipped, metallic, as if spoken by a toy that repeats you. A door offered itself, and Adrian refused it. He had watched too many men step into the corridor that seems the shortest. He took the longer loop, the one under the stairs, the one that always looks like staff. "Why help me?" Victor asked, not to be convinced, but to file the answer under motives. "Because laws are written in a tone of voice," Adrian said. "You'll make the wrong one if you go down as spectacle." Victor smiled, breathless and crooked. "I thought you were allergic to heights," he said again, an old joke to stitch up a new fear. "Only to looking down," Adrian said. The building exhaled. The lamp's insistence dimmed. The human version of the organ's song replaced the wind's. Brooms, bags, low voices. The raid had become its truer shape. Cleanup. Good. He took the stairs the rest of the way and stepped into a hallway where a single emergency light made theater out of dust. He arranged Victor's shoulders with a thumb on the spine. Less hunched, more anonymous. They exited into air that remembered rain like a rumor and turned away from the side where cameras traditionally declare statements. They made the unceremonious walk of men not worth filming. A volunteer with a vest and a kind face glanced at them, saw 2 more people the night had spat out to be dried and dismissed, and returned to the task of making blankets into warmth. Elara did not follow, not because she did not clock variables, but because her attention is finite and she spends it on harm, not on the furniture that keeps harm from sliding across floors. In the shadow under the building's shoulder, Victor braced his hands on his knees and laughed a little with the debt of having not died. That was
"Boring," Adrian said.
exactly as it should be. "Boring," Victor repeated, tasting it, and then, to his own surprise, smiling as if a tight knot in him had eased. "Teach me the next boring thing." Adrian looked at his posture, at the way the city's light lay on his cheekbones, like a boy's future trying on its options. "Tomorrow," he said, "we talk about weather." They left the tower to the men and women who would make it a memo and an invoice. The building hummed a contented note, as if someone had oiled a hinge that had squeaked too long. Above them, a camera blinked the slow blink of a reptile, deciding it had seen enough. The city regained its ordinary volume, which is to say, more than enough to drown a myth if you're willing to help push it under. They cut through an alley that smelled of scallions and hot metal. A cat judged them from a stack of crates with the fairness of a monarch. The rain returned in a momentary confetti, celebratory and useless. Adrian felt the world balance on its ugly little fulcrum. Tonight this way, another night perhaps the other. He did not require victory. He required the seam to hold. Victor exhaled, long and soft, and fell into step. "Weather," he said, like a vow. Chapter 8, Weather Systems. Storms traveled the city in columns like solemn parades. Barricades blinked orange in slow rotations. Traffic cones budded overnight, and by morning had learned the names of pigeons. News vans found their ceremonial positions at curb edges, lifting their ears skyward to speak fluent live. The air had that end-of-rain transparency that makes neon look like veins under skin. People went about the kindness of ordinary plans, buying bagels that would be eaten walking, replying to messages with light to loan. Weather is a function, not an event. Adrian taught Victor to feel it the way sailors read water, the way dogs read shame. They met under the highway ramp centuries had erected out of bolt and compromise. Pigeons had made of it a parliament. Graffiti confessed and boasted. One slab of concrete insisted that Aaron had been here since 2012 and wasn't leaving. Another advised against trusting a man named Nick. Rule 5, Adrian said, not smiling. If there are cameras, behave as if you are bored of yourself. Victor's eyebrows rose. You think I can't? I think you don't know how handsome you are, Adrian said. And that it is a hazard, not a virtue, in a city hungry for characters. Victor pretended to pout. Then he practiced the posture. Shoulders slightly forward, chin neither up nor down, hands visible, eyes engaged but not inquisitive. It was not humiliation. It was a uniform. He wore it with the attention of a boy trying on his father's coat and finding it fits if he stands a certain way. They walked the city as if rehearsing a play called We Belong Here. See the camera, Adrian said, pointing with his chin to a dome nestled in a bodega's eave. Do not be the scene. See the puddle. It is a mirror. Do not give it your face to frame. See the bus shelter. Glass doubles your mistakes. See the diner's window. It throws you back at yourself at an angle. If you look, you invite a story. Victor laughed, then caught the cadence of the street and made the laugh quieter. Still a laugh, merely not a declaration. You think everyone is watching. I wish they were, Adrian said. I would prefer vigilance to surveillance. What we have is the latter. They passed the bridge, where someone had written, "You are doing great," in chalk with the furious sincerity of a friend who doesn't know your details. Victor touched the words as if to test their chalkhood. The mark smudged and made him look as if he'd volunteered at a kindness. People smiled back at him reflexively. Weaponize that, Adrian said dryly. Let the city decide you are here for errands. He introduced Victor to emergency exits that existed only in reality, not on plans. The service door that swallows a diligent man with a mop and can swallow you too if you carry a mop's posture. The concave of a delivery truck's blind side. The exact measure of shadow and scaffolding where a camera's roll-off begins. He taught him to recognize the hum of a building that stores footage versus the yawn of one that merely displays. He taught him the grammar of polite trespasses and the ethics of leaving nothing broken enough for anyone to have to fix. They ate at a diner where the cook cupped his hand over a grill's cough and spoke to the eggs like a dad. The waitress had the lopsided calm of someone whose spine had learned grace under trays. She poured coffee with a confidence that could be put on a CV if the world cared to pay for the right skills. Victor watched her, a little mesmerized. She's better at survival than I am, he admitted. She has more practice at doing it without applause, Adrian said. Try that. They talked craft. It is a word most people reserve for violin makers and bakers. Adrian used it for feeding. No drift, he said. No bruises where you don't intend them. No story for anyone to tell that ends in a committee meeting. No calling cards. No ghost notes left in a neck to be discovered by a lover. You're not a poem. You're a plumber. Victor flinched and then visibly accepted it. Plumber, he repeated. The humility sat strangely on his mouth, and then fit. Okay. Adrian introduced him to Tria. The word sat bitter on the tongue, but it was nobler than any anthem. You will see the worst of us, he said. The cruel, the clever, the bored. You will want to take it personally. You cannot. You can only decide not to protect them. When the weather turns and Elara's net goes tight, you do not warn the loud and the bright and the delightedly terrible. You do not become a shepherd for wolves. You let engineering and paperwork claim them. That's betrayal, Victor said, automatic. It's citizenship, Adrian said. If we intend to live here without rewriting the city's laws in Panic's voice, then we must help the city tell a boring story about us. We are not a movement. We are a nuisance best handled by enforcement action with bad coffee. Victor chewed that like a piece of gristle. And if they come for us all anyway, they will, Adrian said. Eventually. Weather changes. You plan for seasons, not afternoons. They practice boredom as performance art in places that would appreciate it most. The DMV line at lunch, the back pew of a church during a weekday funeral, a hospital lobby where television's muttered encouragements no one needed. Victor learned how to hold a folded newspaper without reading it. He learned small talk that made people excuse him from further notice. He learned to be the guy who carries extra napkins, Being useful is camouflage. Night found them under the highway again, the pigeons arguing about crumbs. Victor rubbed the chalk from his fingers at last, as if ending a shift. "I can do it," he said. "I can be uninteresting." "Good," Adrian said. "It's a rarer skill than charisma." They watched the city rehearse its small reconciliations. A cyclist apologized after a near miss and meant it. The pedestrian forgave him for sport. A man carried a sleeping child toward a bus. The child's had a heavy planet in the crook of his arm. An old couple crossed against the light and were defended by 4 strangers who stepped into the lane with them, shoulders out, an improvised honor guard. "Rule 6, Adrian said. "Participate in the world's mercy when you can. It buys us nothing officially, but it induces a local weather system that is hospitable to our survival." Victor glanced at him sidelong. "You talk like a monk." "I talk like a man who has learned to love memos," Adrian said. "They keep fire in fireplaces. They wove through nights." And Victor learned the shapes of silence that are not surrender. He tried and failed, and tried again not to be seen by lenses that award points for profiles. He confronted, once, a young dead like himself who was carving a flourish into an arm for pleasure, and he did not win the argument. He won the positioning. He moved the scene to a place where the aftermath would be a complaint and not an editorial. After, he vomited into a drain with embarrassed fury, and Adrian held his collar like a brother who refuses to let dignity drown, and said, "That feeling will save you if you listen to it before it becomes entertainment." Summer lightning framed a skyline of cranes and ambition. Rain came and went like a rumor in a crowded room. Elara's people kept their hours, dull and righteous, making arrest reports with boxes ticked properly. Victor brought them, subtly by omission and by the speed of his own movement, those who had decided to be noise. He told himself names for it: triage, redirection, self-defense. He did not tell himself the word betrayal again. It didn't help. He went hungry sometimes, the craft demanded it, and found, after the 3rd such night, that hunger quieted him. Quiet brought observation. Observation brought something like awe. He watched a baker tie a ribbon on a box as if the knot carried blessing. He watched a janitor polish a brass plate because it meant the building would be less sad in the morning. He watched a pair of kids trade headphones back and forth, feeding each other half a song at a time, as if learning a language. One evening, under the ramped shade, with traffic writing its dumb lullaby overhead, Victor said, "I don't hate boring anymore." "It's not boring," Adrian said. "It's the difference between a myth and a city." They stood with their hands in their pockets and let the pigeons judge them as equal fools. Above the highway, a rectangle of sky tried blue, failed, tried again. The weather system they'd helped build, not heroics, not confessions, just adjustments, held the temperature down. Enough. Chapter 9, Lines and Names. Elara Voss had learned patience in 1,000 rooms with bad chairs. She sat with her back, not touching the chair's back. A discipline that reads as poise and feels like work, and watched a composite image refuse to become a person. The angle, and the boy who had decided to wear his face like a declaration, Victor. Between them, a pattern. Wrong places that wanted to be right, right places dangerously adjacent to wrong. Her wall maps had become overfamiliar. She could close her eyes and see the pushpins like constellations. She rubbed the tired patch of skin between thumb and forefinger and looked instead at paperwork, a language she found ugly and honest. The forms told her what the room upstairs had wanted to be. The blanks told her who had refused to be named. She highlighted nothing. Highlighter is for students. She underlined with a pencil that had bitten marks up the wood. The diary lived in the bottom drawer, wrapped in a grocery bag, because the woman who had guarded it had believed the ordinary can be as holy as any reliquary. Elara opened it only when the work required humility. Thin paper, lamplight slanted across ink. A man on a bridge, heat moving through wood, the song a boy whistled while carrying kindling. The ancestor had written of fear, as if it were weather. He had blamed himself, of course, men who right remember themselves large. Elara took from it not the guilt but the geometry. bridges, crowds. The way a city arranges itself to commit a sin in broad daylight and then pretend it never learned the steps. She put the diary away and went to the rail spur where clinic shipments paused in an unphotogenic corner of town. The chain-link fence had grown barbs as if evolution could speed itself to meet need. Floodlights bleached the ground colorless. The guard in the box had the elective deafness of a man who knows hearing leads to paperwork. Elara stood where her beam of light would be useful rather than spectacular. She let the night come to her, as the night likes to do when people in it are sure they are alone. Victor arrived first, moving in a manner that told two stories. You are being watched, and you are trying not to look watched. He handled the chain link as if it were a fabric, rolled the top with his palm, dropped light as a cat. He went not for a throat, not for a person, but for the spillage, puddled hemoglobin in a pan, a small river of red left standing behind a dolly, the sort of surplus that tempts men to write their own rules. He was not gentle with it. He was efficient. He lifted, capped, secured. He might have been a man paid to transport vials, if anyone with budget had paid for such a thing. He froze when Elara's beam found the air near him and made the dust visible. "Make a wrong move," said a voice behind Elara, "and you'll make a law." She turned and found Adrian, as if the night had exhaled him. He stood not in darkness, but in the kind of light that refuses to put ideas on your face. He inclined his head, a politeness that acknowledged neither guilt nor supremacy. Elara said his name, which she did not have, as if she had always had it. Adrian. It made a chord in the air. Name, posture, tone. He gave her the gift most men refuse. He did not offer speech. He offered a transaction. "I will give you rhythms," he said. "You will call them your investigation. I will help you write memos instead of myths." "What do you want?" Elara asked. The right question, asked in the right key. "That you spend your torches carefully," he said. "That you set them only to wood that burned itself already. That you do not write ordnance with boys' faces in your eyes." Elara let the beam fall and then brought it back up lower, a courtesy to the boy crouched with the pans. Victor did not bolt. Good. She liked boys who learned. She'd lost too many who didn't. "You think I can choose the city's weather," she said. "You can choose the story the city writes on forms," he said. "That is the only weather that matters in the long term." They stood together, two instruments tuned to different rooms. Elara felt the pull of her ancestors' diary like a string around a finger reminding her to be personal. She ignored it in favor of the habit that keeps the living alive. She would not hunt a myth if a memo would do. She asked for specifics the way one asks how to fold a map. Adrian gave them as if offering directions to a diner. The hour when the door looked unimportant, the corner the camera had forgotten to protect, the pattern of the auctioneer's patter, the generator's cough before it apologized. He offered names of men who had turned fear into small business. He offered none of the romance that stories strew on sins. "You'll give me villains," Elara said. "And in return I give you what? A promise that I'll pretend you don't exist." "In return you give me dullness," Adrian said. The city yawns. It yawns at us. Nothing makes law when a city yawns. Victor rose, the pan secure, mouth a line that tried not to be a smile. He looked not at Elara's face but at her boots, noting mud, noting laces, learning her as a species rather than a person. This is how boys survive men like Adrian, triangulating the women who do the work. Elara watched him and did not reach for him. "What's your plan for that one?" she asked Adrian. "He learns plumbing," Adrian said, and if it sounded absurd, it was also precise. She did not nod. She adjusted her beam to illuminate a different spot on the gravel that had nothing to do with them. "We have a raid tomorrow," she said. "A room upstairs. We'll be careful. If you make it easier, I will call it good luck." "Don't say my name in any room with cameras," he said. "I won't say your name in rooms with flowers," she said. "I don't put men in my mouth that way." He almost smiled.
It was not flirtation.
It was professional respect between people who have learned to be coins in other machines. They parted with nothing like ceremony. Elara catalogued the choir of little sounds that had accompanied the exchange. A chain-link sigh after being touched. The hum of a refrigerated truck too proud of its job. the whisper of a boy's shoes on gravel trying to read as wind. She filed them under, tonight, and went back to a desk where she could make them into sentences dull enough to elicit signatures. In the morning, the raid would become a press conference. She would stand where the light did not mock ankles, would say the words she had chosen for being too simple to misquote. She would mention no myths. She would thank sanitation. She would ask for patience. Someone would call her a bureaucrat as an insult, not knowing she wore it like armor. Later, she would water the plant that refused to, thrive, and consider the ways in which all care is prophecy. Adrian watched from the peripheral zones he had taught Victor to love. He counted breaths and buses. He traced the line from rail yard to tower to tunnel and found it thinner, less ready to burn. He did not think himself hero. He thought himself seam. The fabric held where seams are meant to hold. He would accept that as victory because it could be replicated. Victor bent under the chain link again with the ease of an animal learning a fence. He did not look back to see whether the woman with the steady beam had marked or spared him. He had decided, for now, to be a rumor's auxiliary. It would hurt someday.
He chose it anyway.
He had learned to choose costs he could live with. Elara wrote names on paper, and where names were not available, she wrote descriptions like man with tired kindness around the eyes, woman in scrubs who kept telling jokes softly to a terrified arm, boy who did not run when it would have made sense to run. She did not keep those notes in the official file. She kept them where she kept the diary, the drawer that holds the part of a city that cannot be legislated. The weather turned down a degree. The day's heat failed to climb into danger. Somewhere a man who would have loved chaos slept instead because he had not been invited to star. Somewhere a woman who would have been made example went home with a bruise no one would see and a story no one would ever have to write. Somewhere a boy whose grin had once been sharp practice sipping coffee with both hands around the cup and learned to enjoy the heat. The city accepted these quiet edits.
It breathed. Its laws did not change that day.
That was the point. Chapter 10. The city still beats. The market ended in binders. The vans were impounded with the apologetic efficiency of men who prefer paperwork to drama. The charges did not mention monsters. They mentioned temperatures and licenses and the unromantic details of who had put what in which box without initials. The press conference looked the way Elara had planned it. Hair under control, language under less, a sign language interpreter with the charisma in the whole room, a line of people behind a podium trying with all their might not to look like a wall. "We are here for safety," she said into microphones that had learned to lie and tell the truth with equal deafness. "If you are cold, we will warm you. If you are afraid, we will stay." Live captions made stay into say, and a few men in comments had fun. The rest of the city changed channels after 2 minutes and went back to its chores. Victor moved apartments, not because the old one was unsafe, but because he wanted walls that had not yet heard his old ideas. The new room had a window that faced an internal courtyard where plants failed valiantly, and 2 doors that did not align, and a patch of sun that he did not need but appreciated for the way it warmed furniture. He learned the liturgy of soft shoes. He learned how to leave a place unchanged except for the absence of hazard. He learned to go hungry too often, and to call that craft instead of punishment. He stopped composing signatures in his head for the imaginary scene where someone would find his work and name it. He learned to perform an absence, so convincing, even the mirror had trouble remembering him. Adrian kept his habits like prayer. The bridge rail knew his palm. The buses kept to their versions of schedule, and he kept his versions of counting. 2 late, 1 early, the singing driver on the line that crosses at dawn. He made himself available to small uses, a woman with a suitcase and an uncooperative curb. A man whose umbrella had inverted into a squid and needed a second hand to return it to obedience. A child who dropped a coin into a drain and cried until Adrian retrieved a thing more tarnished, but equally round. None of this redeemed anything. Redemption is a word for men who want to be stories. He preferred repair. Elara watered the plant that refused, still, to thrive. She adjusted the blinds to a configuration that would not help. She filed memos and made herself refuse the romance of dramatizing them for colleagues. She met with a budget officer who disliked adjectives and had built a career on balancing adjectives with numerals. She won an extra lamp for a room that would surprise someone in a way that would prevent a law. She lost the argument for 3 more blankets and found them anyway by asking a church with a cupboard. She went home with a headache that meant she had asked the right amount. A few men who had believed themselves merchants slept in cool rooms and discovered that the clink of a door closing is almost always the same note in every jail in every city. They told themselves elaborate stories about why this had happened to them. The stories did not include the word careless. The stories rarely do. Their lawyers met with Elara in rooms with neutral carpet. Neutral carpet does half the ethical work in the city. They made deals without the word myth entering anyone's mouth. The cameras got bored. Boredom, like rust, is a salvation that doesn't win awards. The story that might have crawled to the part of the newspaper where cities are routinely invited to be ashamed did not make it there. It spent a day on the news cycle's damp shelf and was replaced by a dog reunion, a traffic anomaly, a segment about heat domes. People who would have attended vigils did not lose anything to grief that week that they wouldn't have lost anyway. It matters, though no one throws a parade. Victor, practicing the religion of being unremarkable, sat sometimes in public spaces and watched the city trust him. A grandmother slid a bag across a bench to give him room. A barista corrected his order gently when he shut down at the register and said, "Hot," like a man learning to speak. A child showed him a rock. He nodded with appropriate awe. He felt himself not humbled, but changed by the city's casual mercy, by the way it offers millions of tiny permissions to continue, none of which would survive inspection, all of which make the organism function. He stopped wanting to be exceptional and started wanting to be contributory. It did not make him good. It made him useful. Sometimes he failed old tests and desired old attention. He caught himself almost stepping into a rooftop to admire the city admiring itself, and instead went downstairs to carry a box for a woman who said, "Thank you, sweetheart," with a softness that covered his need like a blanket. He considered this a win not because it made him better, but because it meant a camera missed him. He saw the cruel and the loud, and he did not save them. He paid for that with nights spent staring at a ceiling where the plaster looked like maps of continents nobody visits. Adrian sat with him, silent, counting along the bus routes in his head until the boy's breath matched the city's larger rhythm. They said nothing about betrayal. They said a few words about plumbing, about Tria, about the pitiless kindness of deciding who not to help. They both failed to sleep and then slept anyway, as all creatures do when the body tires of philosophy. Once, Adrian met Elara at a donut shop pressed into an angle between 2 uglier buildings. They stood under a camera that was turned on and bored. They ordered coffee with milk and ate cake with sugar and said the kinds of things people say in front of microphones.
"Weather," he said. "Paperwork," she said.
The woman behind the counter put extra napkins between the cups. They walked away in opposite directions with the relief of people who do not owe each other stories and therefore can afford to be kind. The city underlined itself with small miracles. The mural on 11th acquired a layer that improved it by introducing discomfort. The soup kitchen added a 3rd shift and discovered that 2 in the morning is when thanks is quietest and therefore most sincere. A club closed for renovations because a daughter had a baby who needed sleep and then never reopened because the daughter's father decided he liked the way the street sounded without the bass. A man planting trees with a group of volunteers chose the ugly ones, the ones that fail and are replanted 3 times, because persistence is a form of beauty the city pays back with shade. Adrian counted buses and found a new driver on the line that crosses the bridge at 4. This one sang to a different tune and off-key. It pleased him more than competence would have. He touched the rail as if touching a memory he chose to keep polished. He forgave himself nothing, and he also refused to let guilt write policy. He allowed the night to be what nights are when watched by a man determined to help them end in mops instead of funerals. Rain returned on schedule, as if paid. Neon turned the wet to veins again. The living did their mathematics, rent, time, love, coffee, and came up with solutions sufficient for another cycle. Somewhere, Victor chose the stair not because he feared the rooftop, but because he preferred the janitor's light to the skyline's applause. Somewhere, Elara deleted the sentence that would have made her sound righteous and replaced it with one that would be read by the person who could sign a line that allowed a blanket budget to expand. Somewhere, a boy with a leather jacket who had once thought himself a story carried a bag of groceries for a neighbor and did not tell anyone about it, which is the point. The city beat on, and the pulse did not ask who listened. It pleased the city, perhaps, that men like Adrian still offered an ear. It did not require him. That is the greatness of cities. They forgive both the absence and the presence of their caretakers by simply going on. He slid into the crowd again, the seam between two patterns, a person you would swear you had seen somewhere and then failed to place, as if he were a line break in a poem you liked but could not quote. On a corner where the ad inside the bus shelter had faded to the color of nothing, he paused and watched the late buses come. 2, then 3, then the singing driver. He smiled without calling attention to it. The neon bled down the street, and the rain pulled it up again, and the city in its infinite, unsentimental mercy kept making rooms for people to do their tiny good, their tiny harm, their tiny work. He turned and walked, not toward a destiny or an ending, but into more city, which is to say, into continuity. The chapter closed because chapters do. The story did not end. It adjusted. And for the kind of creature Adrian had consented to be, adjustment is the only immortality worth practicing. Epilogue after the rain. He'd arrived without poetry, no rolling thunderheads, no theatrical downpour, just a lid lowered over the city until every breath felt like lifting something heavy. Asphalt off-gas last year's sun. Subway platforms exhaled the smell of pennies and old gum. Window units rattled like tired teeth. The sky forgot how to be sky and settled for the color of air after a fluorescent bulb dies. Adrian felt it in the crowds before he felt it on his skin. Heat thins patience. It changes the note of the city's pulse. Hearts race half a beat faster, and with that acceleration, small grievances approach the speed of mistakes. He walked with the weather the way he always did, collar open, pace human, hands visible, and listened beneath the engines to the hydraulics of bodies pushing blood too quick. It was afternoon edging toward a hot dusk when the substation coughed. The first ripple was soundless, lights dimmed by a fraction, a long blink that made the world realize it had eyelids, and then the second ripple came, the loud, collective groan of compressors giving up. A blackout rolled block to block like a rumor finally earning its headline. Shadows took their positions. Stores shrugged their gates down halfway to pretend closure, while still taking cash. Ice turned to water, and water to urgency in bodegas where popsicles softened into pity. Elevators paused between floors and chose to become rooms. The city is a marvel until it must rely on the wearing parts. Adrian turned toward the bridge out of habit. Steel calms him. River corrects hubris, then corrected himself. Bridges in heat are stages. Stories form there too easily. He chose the streets that go unnoticed when the power dies. Side roads with good bones and bad reputations. The underbellies of towers whose lobbies think they are hotels. On one, a barber brought his chair outside and shaved men by natural light with the gravity of a surgeon returning to first principles. On another, a deli owner filled paper cups with ice and passed them down a line of strangers who became a community in exactly the time it takes ice to melt. Boredom, he reminded himself. Weather, not wonder. He heard Victor before he saw him. The particular unhurried scuff of a man who used to swagger and has traded it for something subtler. The boy, no longer a boy in the way the city defines boy, stepped out of a doorway with a case of water shared between his arms and a neighbor's. His hair had grown out, and his grin had learned politesse. Visible, but not predatory. He had mastered the art of placing himself in frames, and then dissolving before the narrative could set. Grids out on the south spur, Victor said, tipping his head toward the industrial edge of the district. Cameras went blind at the clinic transfer yard. Guess who likes the dark? Everyone who writes their name in it, Adrian said. He took the other side of the water case and let his bones do the small work. We'll need to redirect weather. Victor's mouth flickered around a smile that wasn't about performance. Plumbing. Plumbing. Adrian agreed. The yard was a lattice of chain link and the kinds of doors that symbolized permission without guaranteeing it. Floodlights that had been arrogant in rain were flaccid now. The only bright things were vests. The volunteers Elara had trained into steadiness. The guard in the booth, glossy with sweat, looked as if he'd been asked to be all the city at once. Elara arrived without ceremony, no caravan, no media, just a car that could carry four and a clipboard that would not become a prop on the news. Heat had pulled her hair off her neck. A line of concentration had written itself between her brows. She walked the perimeter like a farmer checking fences before a storm and found 3 places where the wire was more suggestion than boundary. Power? She asked the guard, and his shrug was eloquent. Paper? She asked a volunteer, and the volunteer handed over forms damp with a quality that means people will sign anything if you give them a pen and a reason. People? She asked the yard, and the yard told the truth in numbers. Too many moving too fast, wanting stories and finding opportunity. Adrian touched the fence with the back of his knuckles. Metal keeps a memory of what touched it. Heat, hands, cutters. Tonight it remembered the small, neat circle of a tool and the impatience of men who prefer shortcuts. He walked the line until his palm became a thermometer. There, he said, and Victor saw it too, where the fence had been undone and then done again in a rush. Elara followed their attention without asking why they deserved it. She'd learned by now. If you can move the line between harm and myth half an inch toward harm's inconvenience, take the inch. We need to look like paperwork, she said. We need to bore opportunists until they leave on their own time. They built tedium with brisk hands. Cones went up not with flashing lights, but with the aura of inevitability. Clipboards gathered names that could survive court. Volunteers, trained to be concrete when concrete is what the hour needs, formed a queue out of nothing, and the queue did what queues do, tamed appetites by making them wait. Elara spoke to a knot of angry men in a tone that made them pick new adjectives for themselves. She promised nothing and delivered procedure. The yard cooled by 1 grievance per minute. Victor took a corner, the blindest one, and made it polite. He stood visible and unimportant, a man with a clipboard who could be mistaken for anyone's employee. Twice he felt the gravity of a kind of eye he used to enjoy, hungry for chaos, opinionated about spectacle. Twice he arranged to be elsewhere by the time those eyes subtitled him. He learned new inventory, where the shadows were too dark, where the puddles remembered photographs, where heat makes smell louder and therefore evidence. Thirsty, he asked a man whose pupils were thinking about harm. The question annoyed the man into harmlessness. He had planned to feel exceptional. He settled for a plastic cup and the dignity of being served. Victor smiled at himself for the first time that night in a way that didn't read as self-seduction. Boredom works, he said, half to Elara, half to Adrian.
It always did, Adrian said.
Darkness thickened around the corners. In the absence of bright fear, smaller troubles attempted to bloom. A hand on a wrist that hadn't requested it. A rumor about a truck coming with a miracle. A teenager with a screwdriver, and a dream of being useful the wrong way. Elara calibrated. Volunteers took up spots that would become stories, if left unattended. Blankets, she said, then winced at the absurdity of asking for blankets in heat. Old habits. Water, she corrected, and someone had already shouldered cases. She moved a generator just enough to make it visible and therefore less interesting to steal. She asked a nurse in a borrowed fan-cooled van whether she needed a night off and got the only answer that fits. Later, the grid coughed back to life along one edge, flickered, held. A cheer rippled sarcastic and sincere. Streetlights blinked like lizards waking. A row of fridges shuddered and declared themselves alive. Cameras re-entered the century and looked around as if offended by what they'd missed. A man who had planned something with confidence suddenly remembered he loved his mother. He left. Adrian exhaled the breath he hadn't noticed he'd been holding. He let the city's pulse slow back to its usual orchestral brawl.
Heat still pressed.
Work did not leave. But the hour that might have turned into story now promised to end in mop water and binders. He would take that ending every time. Tomorrow this starts again, Elara said, not a complaint, not a prophecy. Different corner, different excuse. Different weather, Adrian said. Same rules, Victor added, and it wasn't a boast. It was gratitude wearing discipline. They stood for a moment where a sliver of wind found them and tried its best. Victor popped the cap off a bottle and handed it to the weary guard, then another to Elara, then one for Adrian he knew would stay sealed. Somewhere a kid started a generator-wheezed boombox and found the only song in the city that agreed with the heat. People groaned, laughed, tolerated. A drone drifted in, took a look, and drifted out, bored by the lack of headline. Elara checked her watch by habit, then remembered clocks are petty in weather like this. "I'll file dull sentences in the morning," she said, giving herself the comfort of something to promise. "We'll add a light here and a lock that doesn't hate its job and a person," she added with a nod at the guard, "who gets to go home on time. Write resilience in there as many times as they'll let you," Victor said with mischief. "They'll let me write it twice," Elara said, smiling despite sweat. "I will mean it both times." They parted the way professionals with different gods part, without touching, with kindness. Elara went toward a car that smelled like crayons and ethanol wipes. Victor slipped into a seam of scaffolding and emerged 2 blocks over next to a shuttered newsstand and a woman, selling hot empanadas from a cooler as if defying physics. Adrian took the road that turned him into context again. Heat lifted around midnight. The lid raised a fraction. The sky was still wrong, but less wrong. The city slept like a person with a fever finding a cooler pillow. A breaker somewhere admitted defeat and would be replaced tomorrow by a man who whistles while he works because he liked his father. A stairwell remembered hands that had steadied strangers. A fence held, insulted and grateful. On the bridge, the rails sang softly under a bus that had found a new driver again. This one did not sing. He hummed. It was enough. Adrian's palm read the note and returned it. He counted vehicles, blessed none, condemned none, practiced his favorite form of immortality, showing up. Somewhere, in the difficult room of a barely sleeping apartment, Victor lay on his back and rehearsed the rules and, for the first time since coming up from the wrong basement into this unwieldy life, felt the future as something other than a story about himself. He thought with a small, odd surge of pride, "I am good at not being a headline." The notion pleased him. He slept. Elara, who had gone home and showered heat from her skin and written 3 emails with the grace of fatigue and a glass of ice beside her, sat on the edge of her bed and opened the drawer that held the diary. She did not read it. She placed her hand on it like a book you swear by and tell the truth to. "Weather," she said quietly to a room that had only plants to overhear. "We have it. We keep it." The city took those private vows the way it takes all vows. Into the aggregate, where they join a billion others and become sidewalks that don't crack as quickly, buses that arrive almost on time, doors that open because someone oiled the hinges last week without announcing it. Neon wrote veins back onto wet pavement with the patience of habit when a late thunderhead finally agreed to come. In its reflections, faces crossed, tired, laughing, endangered, ignorant, wise, all of it, and the seam held. Adrian walked the long block home, though home for him was always more verb than noun. He passed a mural the rain had improved again, a stoop where someone had left books with a note that said "Take one," a bar whose owner had given his generator to a clinic that didn't. He paused at a crosswalk and watched 3 teenagers rehearse a dance in the red light, as if asking the intersection to bless them. It did, as best it could. The pulse beneath the city's engines settled into its daily rough grace. It did not care who heard it. It cared that fewer fires reached it, that fewer songs were sung with torches in their hands. Adrian offered his ears a little longer and then, without flourish, stepped back into the crowd where he belongs most, between stories, beside rules, at the damp hem of weather, invisible and necessary as a scene. If immortality is adjustment, he had it in hand. If heroism is boredom, he would keep practicing. The grid flickered, stabilized, and the night with its overheated breath eased enough to call itself night again. The city beat on. He kept time,